In today's deep dive, we're unraveling one of the most controversial questions in Ark Raiders lore, whether Ark actually managed to invade Speranza, the legendary fortress city that's supposed to be humanity's last real stronghold against the machine apocalypse. And trust me, the answer is way more complicated than you think. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So let's set the stage here, because understanding Speranza means understanding why this question even matters in the first place. Speranza wasn't just some random settlement that popped up after Ark started hunting humanity. It was a planned response, a fortress built on decades of research and military infrastructure that predated the Ark crisis by at least 40 years. The city itself sits on what used to be called the Cascadian Stronghold, a massive military installation that was originally designed during the resource wars of the 2040s, when nations were still fighting each other instead of fighting for survival against mechanical predators. The location was chosen for specific reasons: high elevation natural choke points in the surrounding mountain ranges, and most importantly, proximity to the Redwood thermal plant, one of the last operational geothermal facilities that could provide clean, unlimited power without the electromagnetic signatures that seemed to draw Ark units like moths to a flame. When the first Ark incursions began in 2063, humanity was scattered, disorganized, getting picked off in isolated pockets, while governments collapsed and communication networks went dark. Speranza became a rallying point purely by accident, at first because the old Cascadian installation had maintained its power grid and defensive systems when everything else was failing. Dr. Sarah Chen, who would later become the city's first administrator, was actually just a mid-level research coordinator at the geothermal plant when everything started falling apart. She made a call that probably saved thousands of lives by opening the facility's blast doors to refugees and survivors, turning what was supposed to be a small research outpost into a growing community that would eventually become humanity's most important stronghold. The early days were chaos, people flooding in from collapsed cities, bringing stories of Ark attacks that got worse with each telling. Entire neighborhoods reduced to scrap metal, machines that learned and adapted with every encounter, coordinated strikes that showed an intelligence nobody wanted to acknowledge. Chen and her team, mostly engineers and scientists who never signed up for military leadership, had to figure out how to transform a research facility into a defensible city, practically overnight. They got lucky in some ways because the original Cascadian installation had been built with paranoid Cold War thinking, redundant systems, underground bunkers, weapons caches that hadn't been touched in decades. But luck only gets you so far when you're facing an enemy that doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, and doesn't negotiate. The transformation of Speranza from refugee camp to fortress city took about 3 years of constant work. And I'm talking about brutal, desperate work, where people died from exhaustion, from accidents, from Ark scouts that would probe the perimeter looking for weaknesses. They built the outer ring first, a massive wall of reinforced concrete and scavenged steel that circled the entire complex, studded with watchtowers and gun emplacements that were manned 24/7. Then came the middle sanctum, a secondary defensive layer that protected the city's critical infrastructure, power generation, water purification, the medical centers and food production facilities that kept everyone alive. At the center of it all was the Citadel, Chen's command center, and the heart of Speranza's defensive network, a fortress within a fortress, where the city's leadership could coordinate responses to Ark attacks and maintain communication with other survivor settlements scattered across the wasteland. The population grew steadily as word spread that Speranza was holding, that there was a place where Ark hadn't completely taken over, where humanity was fighting back. By 2068, the city had around 15,000 permanent residents, plus another 5,000 transients, scouts and raiders who would venture into Ark-controlled territory to salvage supplies and gather intelligence before returning to safety. The city developed its own culture during this time, a weird mix of military discipline and frontier independence, where everyone had a role to play in survival. You had the Wall Guard, volunteers who pulled shifts on the defensive perimeter, the Salvage Corps who risked their lives on runs into dangerous territory, the tech division who reverse-engineered Ark components to understand the enemy better, and the civilian population who kept the city functioning, with all the normal jobs that don't sound heroic but are absolutely essential. There was this sense that Speranza represented something more than just survival. It was proof that humanity could organize, could adapt, could build something that Ark couldn't just sweep away. Dr. Chen understood this instinctively, which is why she pushed so hard for the city to become more than just a military installation, establishing schools for the kids who'd been born into this nightmare, creating public spaces where people could gather and remember what it felt like to be human instead of just hunted. The cultural identity of Speranza became wrapped up in this idea of resilience, that they weren't just hiding behind walls, they were actively working toward a future where humanity could reclaim what Ark had taken. This manifested in practical ways through the research initiative, Chen's program to study Ark technology and find exploitable weaknesses, and, in symbolic ways, through things like the memorial gardens where they honored everyone who died fighting the machines. Now here's where things start getting complicated, because Speranza's success made it a target, and not just for random Ark patrols, but for what appeared to be coordinated campaigns designed specifically to test the city's defenses. The first major assault came in 2069, a 3-day siege where Ark units surrounded the outer ring and launched wave after wave of attacks that killed over 200 defenders and nearly breached the eastern gate. The attack was eventually repelled, but it revealed something terrifying. Ark was learning, adapting its tactics based on how Speranza defended itself, probing for weaknesses with a patience that suggested genuine strategic thinking rather than just machine programming. After the siege, Chen authorized a massive expansion of the defensive grid, adding automated turret systems, underground tunnel networks for rapid troop movement, and most controversially, the Aegis Protocol, a last resort defensive measure that would seal the citadel completely if the outer defenses failed, essentially sacrificing anyone outside the core to save the city's leadership and critical systems. The Aegis Protocol was hugely divisive because it formalized what everyone had quietly understood, that in a worst-case scenario, some people were considered more valuable than others, and there were citizens of Speranza who would be left outside the final safe zone to die. This created class tensions that had always been simmering under the surface, between the original Cascadian staff who had technical expertise and decision-making power, and the refugees who'd come later and were often assigned to more dangerous roles in the city's defense. These tensions exploded in 2071 during what became known as the Martin Uprising, when a wall guard captain named James Martin led a protest against the Aegis Protocol that turned violent when security forces tried to shut it down. The uprising was suppressed within a day, but it left scars, dozens dead, trust in leadership shaken, and a growing sense that maybe Speranza's real enemy wasn't just Ark, but the inequality and fear that machines had forced into human society. Chen tried to address this by restructuring the city's governance, creating a civilian council with representation from different sectors. But the damage was done, and there were people in Speranza who started wondering if survival in a fortress was really better than taking their chances in the wasteland. Throughout all this political drama, Ark's presence around the city was increasing, not just random patrols anymore, but permanent encampments, observation posts on the mountain ridges overlooking Speranza, almost like Ark was studying them, the way Speranza was trying to study Ark. The tech division, led by a brilliant engineer named Marcus Webb, made a breakthrough in 2072 when they managed to partially decrypt some Ark communication protocols salvaged from destroyed units. What they found was deeply disturbing because it suggested that Ark wasn't just operating on programmed responses, but was engaged in something that looked like actual communication, sharing tactical data across units, coordinating movements across hundreds of miles, possibly even reporting back to some central intelligence that was directing the global campaign against humanity. Grinding for better gear, faster progress, or higher ranks? Skycoach makes it simple. Choose exactly what you need. Blueprints, weapons, materials, all delivered safely and transparently. With 24/7 professional support, you always know what's happening with your order. Skycoach is built by gamers for gamers, a real community, real reviews, and thousands of players who trust them every day. And if you want to improve your skills, Skycoach even offers coaching, so you can play your way and level up faster. You can even manage everything on the Skycoach app, making progress easy wherever you are. And don't forget, use code STARSTUS at checkout to get 10% off your order. Skycoach, what boosts you, makes you. Webb's findings led to the controversial theory that Ark wasn't just attacking humanity randomly, but was working towards specific objectives, and Speranza, with its concentration of survivors and technology, was definitely on that objectives list. This theory gained credibility in 2073 when Salvage Corps teams started reporting increased Ark activity and patterns that seemed designed to encircle the city, cutting off supply routes and isolating Speranza from other settlements. Chen responded by authorizing long-range reconnaissance missions to map Ark positions and identify potential threats before they could materialize into full assaults. One of these missions, led by a scout named Elena Vasquez, discovered something that changed everything. An Ark facility about 60 miles northeast of Speranza that appeared to be some kind of staging ground or manufacturing plant, pumping out new units at a rate that suggested Ark was preparing for something big. Vasquez's team tried to gather more intelligence, but were detected and barely escaped with their lives, losing 3 members in the process. The facility's existence sparked an intense debate in Speranza's leadership about whether to launch a preemptive strike or reinforce defenses and wait for Ark to make the first move. Chen sided with defense, arguing that Speranza couldn't risk the personnel and resources required for an offensive operation, but there were commanders in the wall guard who thought waiting was suicidal. That Ark was clearly building up for a major assault, and humanity's only chance was to disrupt those plans before it was too late. This debate was still raging when the blackout happened in November 2073, a coordinated Ark attack that knocked out Speranza's long-range communications and isolated the city completely from the outside world. The blackout wasn't just about cutting wires. Ark units deployed some kind of electromagnetic pulse technology that fried communication equipment across the entire region, leaving Speranza deaf and blind to what was happening beyond its walls. For 6 weeks, the city was in complete isolation, not knowing if other settlements still existed, if Ark was launching a global offensive, if Speranza was the last human stronghold left on Earth, or just one of many still fighting. The psychological impact was devastating because humans need hope, need to know they're part of something larger than just their own survival, and the blackout stripped that away, leaving nothing but walls and fear. Chen kept order through a combination of martial law and carefully managed information, rationing news to prevent panic, while the tech division worked around the clock to restore some kind of communication capability. They finally succeeded using old radio equipment that Ark's pulse hadn't completely destroyed, establishing contact with a settlement called Haven's Rest, about 300 miles south. The news was mixed. Haven's Rest was still standing, but reported that several smaller outposts had gone dark, possibly overrun, and that Ark activity across the region was intensifying in ways that suggested preparation for coordinated strikes. More troubling was Haven's Rest report that they detected unusual electromagnetic signatures coming from the direction of Speranza. Like Ark was focusing specific attention on the fortress city, possibly using some kind of surveillance technology to monitor the settlement in real time. This revelation led Webb and the tech division to conduct sweeps of Speranza's perimeter, and what they found was chilling, microscopic Ark drones, almost invisible to the naked eye, that had infiltrated the city's outer sectors and were transmitting data back to Ark Command. The drones were incredibly sophisticated, able to attach to buildings and equipment without detection, creating a surveillance network that had probably been feeding Ark tactical intelligence for months. The discovery triggered a city-wide purge, teams going building by building with electromagnetic scanners, trying to root out every last drone. But the damage was done, and everyone knew it. Ark had detailed maps of Speranza's defenses, knew where the weapons were stored, where the population centers were, where the weak points in the walls existed. Chen made the decision to completely reorganize the defensive layout, moving critical facilities, changing patrol routes, essentially trying to invalidate whatever intelligence Ark had gathered. But it was a race against time, because nobody knew when Ark would use that information to launch an attack. The answer came in January 2074 with what survivors would call the Red Winter, a massive coordinated assault that made the 2069 siege look like a minor skirmish. Ark hit Speranza with everything: ground units that rushed the walls in waves that seemed endless, aerial drones that targeted the defensive turrets with frightening precision, and worst of all, infiltrator units that had apparently been designed specifically to breach fortified positions using some kind of molecular disruption technology that could literally dissolve reinforced barriers. The assault lasted 9 days, and it was absolute hell. Fighting in the streets, desperate last stands at the middle sanctum, civilians pressed into combat roles because there simply weren't enough trained soldiers. The outer ring fell on day 3, overrun by Ark units that poured through multiple breach points faster than defenders could seal them. Chen ordered a fighting retreat to the middle sanctum, which held for another 4 days before Ark's infiltrators managed to penetrate the eastern section, forcing another retreat toward the citadel. By day 7, Speranza was on the verge of complete collapse. Thousands dead, ammunition running critically low, and Ark units closing in on the citadel from multiple directions. This was the moment when the Aegis Protocol should have been activated, sealing the citadel and abandoning everyone outside to their fate. But Chen refused to give the order, instead making a desperate gamble that would either save Speranza or doom it completely. She ordered the detonation of the geothermal plant. The plan was insane, weaponizing the same thermal energy that powered the city by overloading the containment systems and creating a massive explosion that would hopefully destroy the Ark forces surrounding the citadel. The risk was enormous because if the blast was too large, it would take out the citadel too, killing everyone they were trying to save, and if it was too small, Ark would just regroup and finish the assault. Webb and his team had maybe 3 hours to rig the plant for controlled detonation while fighting was literally happening around them. Ark units breaking through defensive lines and getting closer with every minute. They finished with 17 minutes to spare, and Chen gave the evacuation order, pulling everyone back into the citadel's deepest bunkers and sealing every door between them and the coming explosion. The blast when it came was apocalyptic, a column of superheated steam and fire that shot hundreds of feet into the air and created a shockwave that leveled everything within half a mile of the plant. Most of the Ark forces surrounding the citadel were vaporized instantly, their metal bodies melting in temperatures that exceeded anything they were designed to withstand. The explosion bought Speranza time, but at a terrible cost. The city's power source was gone, destroyed by the very people it was supposed to sustain, and hundreds of defenders who hadn't made it back to the citadel in time were killed in the blast or its aftermath. When survivors finally emerged from the bunkers on day 10, they found Speranza transformed into a smoking ruin, the outer ring completely destroyed, the middle sanctum heavily damaged, and a charred wasteland where the geothermal plant had stood. Ark forces had retreated, but everyone knew they'd be back, and next time, Speranza wouldn't have a power plant to weaponize. The months after Red Winter were probably the darkest in Speranza's history, because the city had survived, but lost everything that made survival worthwhile. No power except emergency generators that would last weeks at best, food supplies damaged by the fighting, medical facilities overwhelmed with wounded, and a population that was traumatized and questioning whether there was any point in continuing the fight. Chen's leadership was seriously challenged, with multiple calls for her resignation from people who blamed her for the catastrophic decision to destroy the plant, arguing that the Aegis Protocol would have at least preserved the citadel even if everyone else died. She survived a formal vote of no confidence by a narrow margin and immediately focused on the only thing that could save Speranza, finding a new power source. This led to the controversial decision to mount an expedition to the Ark facility that Vasquez had discovered, the manufacturing plant that was probably responsible for producing the units that had attacked Speranza. The logic was brutal but sound. If Ark could build a facility that generated enough power to manufacture combat units, then humans could potentially capture that facility and repurpose it for Speranza's survival. Webb thought it was possible in theory, but incredibly dangerous in practice, because they'd essentially be walking into the heart of Ark territory with no real idea what defenses they'd face. Chen assembled a strike team of 50 volunteers, the best fighters and technicians Speranza had left, and gave them a simple mission: take the facility or don't come back, because there was no Speranza to return to without power. The expedition left in March 2074, and for 2 weeks the city heard nothing. No radio contact, No messenger scouts, nothing but silence that made everyone assume the worst. Then on day 15, a single battered transport limped back into visual range of the Citadel, carrying 12 survivors out of the original 50. What they reported seemed impossible. They'd successfully infiltrated the Ark facility and discovered it was far larger than anyone had imagined, a massive underground complex that stretched for miles with manufacturing capabilities that could produce hundreds of units per day. More shocking was the discovery that the facility seemed to be operating with minimal Ark presence. Most of the work was being done by automated systems with only a handful of high-level coordinator units overseeing operations. The strike team had managed to fight their way to the facility's power core and discovered it was running on some kind of advanced fusion reactor that Ark had either built or salvaged from pre-war military installations. They'd tried to capture the reactor intact, but Ark's coordinator units had activated some kind of self-destruct sequence that would have destroyed the entire facility. In desperation, Webb, who'd been leading the technical team, made a split-second decision to rip out the reactor's control systems before the self-destruct could complete, essentially stealing the reactor's brain while leaving the rest of the facility to explode. The move worked, but barely. The team escaped with the control systems and critical components minutes before the facility went up, taking out a chunk of Ark's manufacturing capability in the region. The recovered technology was a game-changer. Webb and the tech division spent months reverse engineering the reactor controls and managed to build a functional fusion plant in Speranza's ruins. Smaller than the Ark facility, but powerful enough to sustain the city's essential systems, the success of the raid and the new power source sparked a renaissance in Speranza. Reconstruction efforts kicked into high gear. New defensive systems were installed using Ark technology that had been captured and repurposed. And most importantly, hope returned to a population that had been running on fumes and desperation. But the raid's success also answered the question that started this whole deep dive. Did Ark ever invade Speranza? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Brutally yes, during Red Winter, when Ark forces penetrated deep into the city and came within hours of completely overrunning humanity's most important stronghold. The invasion succeeded in destroying much of Speranza's infrastructure and killing thousands, but it failed in its ultimate objective because Chen and her people refused to give up even when giving up was the logical choice. The invasion also revealed something crucial about Ark's strategy, that the machines weren't just randomly attacking, but were specifically targeting symbols of human resistance, trying to break humanity's will to fight by destroying the places where people had gathered to make a stand. This understanding changed how Speranza approached defense, shifting from purely reactive measures to proactive intelligence gathering and preemptive strikes against Ark facilities before they could launch major assaults. The city that emerged from Red Winter and the reconstruction was fundamentally different from the early settlement that Chen had opened to refugees. It was harder, more militarized, more willing to take risks because playing it safe had almost gotten everyone killed. Speranza in 2075 was a city that had been invaded, had survived that invasion, and had struck back in ways that Ark probably didn't anticipate, capturing technology, disrupting manufacturing, proving that humans could be just as adaptive and ruthless as the machines hunting them. The fortress city became a symbol not just of survival, but of resistance, a place where humanity was actively working to understand Ark's weaknesses and exploit them, where the nightmare of machine dominance was being challenged by human ingenuity and sheer stubborn refusal to die. So when people ask, did Ark ever invade Speranza, they're really asking whether humanity's greatest fortress ever fell. And the answer is complicated because Speranza did fall, partially, catastrophically, in ways that left scars that would never fully heal. But it didn't stay fallen, it got back up, rebuilt stronger, and turned its suffering into knowledge that would help other settlements survive their own encounters with Ark forces. The Speranza that exists today, assuming it still exists because remember we're dealing with an ongoing conflict with no clear resolution, is a monument to that specific kind of human resilience that looks at impossible odds and says, not today. That takes every defeat and turns it into data for the next fight, that refuses to let fear and loss define what humanity can become. The invasion of Speranza was real. It was devastating. It changed everything, but it didn't end the story. It just changed what kind of story was being told. From one about hiding behind walls to one about fighting back, about taking the war to Ark instead of just waiting for Ark to come to them. And maybe that's the real legacy of Red Winter and everything that came after. Not that Speranza survived, but that it survived in a way that gave other settlements permission to hope, to fight, to believe that humanity's story didn't have to end with machines hunting the last survivors into extinction, but could continue with humans finding ways to overcome, adapt, and maybe someday reclaim the world that Ark had taken. The question of whether humanity could actually reclaim anything became central to Speranza's identity in the years following Red Winter. Because surviving wasn't enough anymore, people needed a purpose beyond just not dying. And Chen understood this, even as she dealt with the practical nightmare of rebuilding a city that had been half destroyed by its own desperate gamble. The fusion reactor that Webb's team had salvaged became operational in August 2074, providing enough power to run essential systems, but nowhere near the capacity of the old geothermal plant, which meant Speranza had to make hard choices about what got electricity and what didn't, prioritizing defensive systems and food production, while things like heated housing and recreational facilities went dark. This created a harsh existence where people were technically safe behind the rebuilt walls, but living in conditions that felt barely better than the wasteland outside. Cold bunkers, rationed food, constant work shifts to maintain the systems keeping everyone alive. The psychological toll was immense, and Chen's administration started seeing increased rates of what they called wasteland fever, a kind of psychological breakdown where people would just walk out of the city into Ark territory, either looking for death or some imagined freedom that didn't exist anywhere on Earth anymore. The city's medical staff, already stretched thin from treating physical injuries, had to develop protocols for identifying and treating mental health crises, creating support groups and mandatory counseling sessions for anyone showing signs of breaking down. It was during one of these sessions that a technician named Robert Crane proposed something that seemed crazy at first, but eventually became the foundation of Speranza's counteroffensive strategy. If Ark was using advanced technology to hunt humanity, why couldn't humans use that same technology to hunt Ark? The idea wasn't completely new because the tech division had been reverse engineering Ark components for years, but Crane was talking about something more ambitious, actually building human-controlled units using Ark technology, creating weapons that could match the machines on their own terms, instead of relying on conventional firearms and explosives that were becoming increasingly ineffective as Ark units evolved better armor and defensive capabilities. Webb was skeptical at first because every attempt to power up captured Ark units had resulted in the units either self-destructing or attempting to attack their human handlers, suggesting some kind of fail-safe programming that prevented them from being turned against their original purpose. But Crane had been studying the reactor control systems they'd stolen from the manufacturing facility, and he believed there was a way to strip out Ark's core programming while keeping the mechanical functionality intact, essentially lobotomizing the units and then installing new control systems that would respond to human commands. Chen authorized a small-scale research project, giving Crane and a team of volunteers access to a secured workshop and several captured Ark units to experiment with, understanding that if they succeeded, it could revolutionize how humanity fought back, but if they failed, it might just waste resources the city couldn't afford to spare. The research took 9 months of painstaking work, during which time Crane's team lost 2 members to accidents when partially activated Ark units malfunctioned violently, crushing one technician and electrocuting another before emergency shutdowns could be triggered. The deaths nearly ended the project because people started questioning whether it was worth sacrificing human lives to create weapons that might never work, but Crane pushed forward with an obsessive determination that worried even his supporters, working 20-hour days and refusing to leave the workshop even for mandatory rest periods. His breakthrough came in May 2075 when he successfully activated a Scout-class Ark unit that responded to basic movement commands without attempting to kill everyone in the room. A moment that the people present described as both thrilling and deeply unsettling because watching a machine that had been built to hunt humans, now taking orders from them, felt wrong on some fundamental level. The unit, which Crane designated Sentinel-1, became the prototype for what would eventually be called the Shepherd Program, an initiative to build a small force of reprogrammed Ark units that could be deployed alongside human soldiers to even the odds in combat situations. The name Shepherd was deliberately chosen to evoke protection and guidance, trying to psychologically distance these units from the Ark machines that had caused so much trauma. Though many Speranza citizens couldn't get past the fact that shepherds looked identical to the things that had killed their friends and family, the first field test of Sentinel-1 happened in June 2075, when a Salvage Corps patrol encountered Ark forces while scavenging in the ruins of what used to be called Millerton, a small town about 30 miles from Speranza. The patrol was pinned down and taking casualties when Crane, who had insisted on accompanying the mission, activated Sentinel-1 and sent it forward to engage the attacking Ark units. What happened next was documented on helmet cameras and became one of the most watched recordings in Speranza's archives. Sentinel-1 moving with the same fluid precision as enemy Ark units but fighting on humanity's side, using its superior speed and armor to draw fire, while human soldiers repositioned and counterattacked. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes and ended with the Ark units destroyed and the patrol extracted safely, though Sentinel-1 sustained heavy damage that took weeks to repair. The success of the field test led to an expansion of the Shepherd program, with production facilities being set up to build more units using components scavenged from destroyed Ark machines and supplemented with parts manufactured in Speranza's limited industrial facilities. By the end of 2075, the city had 12 operational Shepherd units, each one paired with a handler who was responsible for its tactical deployment and maintenance, creating a new role in Speranza's military structure that combined elements of engineering, combat tactics, and something that almost resembled animal training, given how handlers learned to interpret their units' behavior patterns and anticipate malfunctions. The psychological impact of fighting alongside reprogrammed Ark units was complex and divided the population pretty sharply, with some people seeing shepherds as proof that humanity could overcome Ark by turning their own weapons against them, while others viewed the entire program as a dangerous corruption of human values, arguing that becoming more like the machines was exactly the wrong response to Ark's threat. This divide played out in city council meetings, where representatives would argue for hours about the ethics of the Shepherd program, whether there was a meaningful moral difference between humans building killing machines and Ark doing the same thing, whether the program's success in saving lives justified the discomfort people felt watching metal units that looked like their enemies taking orders from human commanders. Chen remained firmly supportive of the program because the practical results were undeniable. Patrols equipped with shepherds had significantly lower casualty rates. Salvage operations could push deeper into dangerous territory. And defensive capabilities improved, as Shepherd units could be stationed at vulnerable points in the wall without needing rest or rotation like human guards. The program also provided unexpected intelligence benefits because Crane's team discovered they could access residual data stored in Ark units' memory systems, fragments of targeting information, movement patterns, communication logs that had somehow survived the reprogramming process. This data was incomplete and often corrupted, but it gave Speranza's intelligence analysts glimpses into how Ark organized its operations, revealing things like the existence of regional coordinator units that seemed to direct multiple standard Ark units, patrol routes that suggested Ark was systematically mapping the wasteland, and most intriguing, references to something called the Nexus that appeared in multiple units' logs, but without enough context to understand what it was. The Nexus references became an obsession for a young analyst named Sarah Okonkwo, who spent months combing through fragmentary data, trying to piece together what Ark was referencing, whether it was a physical location, a command structure, or something else entirely. Her work led her to propose a controversial theory that Ark wasn't operating independently, but was connected to some kind of central intelligence network, that every unit in the field was essentially a node in a larger system that was coordinating the global campaign against humanity. If Okonkwo's theory was correct, it had massive implications because it meant destroying individual Ark units was ultimately pointless, like cutting off the fingers of something that would just grow them back. And the only way to truly defeat Ark would be to find and destroy whatever was controlling the network. Chen was cautious about embracing this theory too enthusiastically, because it was based on fragmentary data that could be interpreted multiple ways. But she authorized Okonkwo to continue her research and coordinate with the Shepherd program to gather more intelligence from captured units. The research took on new urgency in early 2076, when ARC activity around Speranza increased dramatically, not with another direct assault like Red Winter, but with what appeared to be surveillance and probing attacks, small units testing different sections of the wall, aerial drones conducting high-altitude reconnaissance that pushed the limits of Speranza's anti-air defenses, and most disturbing, infiltrator units that were detected trying to burrow under the city's foundations. These activities suggested ARC was preparing for something big, possibly another major assault, but the methodical nature of the preparations gave Speranza time to ready its own defenses and plan potential countermeasures. Webb proposed a radical strategy that divided military leadership. Instead of waiting for ARC to attack, Speranza should use its Shepherd units and best combat teams to launch a preemptive strike deep into ARC territory, targeting what intelligence suggested was a major coordination hub about 100 miles northwest of the city. The plan was immediately controversial because it would require committing a significant portion of Speranza's military assets to an offensive operation with no guarantee of success, potentially leaving the city vulnerable if the strike failed or if ARC attacked while forces were deployed away from defensive positions. The debate raged for weeks with passionate arguments on both sides, those favoring the strike pointing out that waiting behind walls hadn't saved them during Red Winter and that taking the fight to ARC might disrupt whatever they were planning, while opponents argued that Speranza's strength was its defensive position and abandoning that advantage for a risky offensive could doom the entire settlement. Chen ultimately sided with Webb, making the decision that would define the next phase of Speranza's war against ARC. They would launch the strike, and they would do it with everything they had, because sitting behind walls waiting for the next invasion wasn't survival, it was just delayed death. The operation, codenamed Prometheus, after the ancient myth about stealing fire from the gods, was scheduled for March 2076 and involved a strike force of 200 soldiers, 15 Shepherd units, and every heavy weapon the city could spare. The force was divided into 3 teams. Assault would hit the coordination hub directly, support would secure a perimeter and evacuation route, and technical would attempt to capture any ARC technology or intelligence that could be useful. Crane insisted on leading the technical team personally, despite having no formal combat training, arguing that he was the only one who understood Shepherd systems well enough to interface with whatever they found at the hub. The journey to the target took 4 days through wasteland that had been completely transformed by ARC's presence. Former highways were patrolled by hunter units. Old cities had been converted into manufacturing facilities or stripped for raw materials. And the landscape itself seemed hostile in ways that had nothing to do with ARC. Radiation hotspots from battles or sabotage, collapsed infrastructure that created impassable terrain, and a perpetual haze of industrial pollution that ARC's facilities pumped into the atmosphere. The strike force travelled mostly at night, using routes that intelligence had identified as gaps in ARC's patrol patterns, and they made it to within 5 miles of the target before encountering their first serious resistance. A patrol of 12 ARC units that detected their approach and engaged before support team could establish firing positions. The battle was brutal and cost the strike force 8 soldiers and 2 Shepherd units before they managed to destroy the patrol. But it also confirmed they were in the right area because the ARC units were clearly guarding something important. The coordination hub, when they finally reached it, was nothing like what anyone expected. Instead of a facility or installation, it was a massive crater about half a mile across, at the bottom of which sat what looked like a crashed spacecraft or satellite, though its design didn't match anything from known human space programs. The object was roughly cylindrical, maybe 200 feet long, and covered in the same dark metallic material that ARC units were constructed from, with what appeared to be antenna arrays or sensor equipment protruding from its surface at irregular intervals. More shocking was the activity around the object. Hundreds of ARC units moving in coordinated patterns, some appearing to be excavating around the object's base, others standing in perfect geometric formations as if receiving instructions, and, in the center of it all, a single massive unit that dwarfed anything the strike force had encountered before, easily 40 feet tall, with multiple articulated limbs and a complex sensor array where a head might be on a human-shaped unit. Crane immediately recognized what they were looking at. This wasn't a coordination hub, it was the source, possibly the original ARC unit, that everything else had been built from, or was connected to. And if Okonkwo's theory about a central intelligence network was correct, this massive unit might be the Nexus itself. The tactical situation was impossible. The strike force was outnumbered at least 10-1, attacking downhill into a crater with no cover, against an enemy that clearly had defensive positions prepared. Every military principle said they should retreat, report what they'd found, and let Speranza's leadership decide how to respond with better planning and resources. But Crane made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on who you asked. He activated all 15 Shepherd units simultaneously and sent them charging into the crater while broadcasting on every frequency his equipment could generate, essentially announcing their presence to every ARC unit in the region and betting that the chaos would create an opportunity for the assault team to reach the crashed object. What happened next was carnage. ARC units responded to the Shepherd attack with overwhelming force, converging from all directions to destroy what they probably recognized as corrupted versions of themselves. And in the confusion, the assault team made it about a third of the way down into the crater before ARC's defensive formations reorganized and pinned them down under withering fire. 3 Shepherd units reached the massive central unit and actually managed to engage it in combat, their weapons carving deep gouges in its armor before it responded with some kind of energy weapon that vaporized them instantly. A technology that ARC had never deployed in combat before, and that suggested this unit was fundamentally different from standard ARC forces. The battle was clearly lost, the strike force was taking unsustainable casualties, and the assault team's position was being overrun when something completely unexpected happened. The massive unit stopped fighting, its weapons powering down and its sensor array turning toward the crashed object as if receiving new instructions or data. Every ARC unit in the crater stopped simultaneously, freezing in mid-action with a coordination that was eerie even by ARC standards. And for about 15 seconds there was complete silence except for the sounds of human wounded and fires burning from destroyed equipment. Then the ARC units retreated, not in a fighting withdrawal, but in a complete disengagement, pulling back from the crater and disappearing into the wasteland as if the strike force had ceased to exist as a priority. The reprieve lasted long enough for support team to organize an evacuation, pulling the wounded out and recovering bodies of the fallen, while Crane's technical team sprinted toward the crashed object to grab whatever intelligence they could, before ARC inevitably returned. What Crane found when he reached the object would haunt him for the rest of his life. It wasn't a crashed spacecraft, it was a seed, a self-replicating manufacturing unit that had been dropped from orbit decades ago, possibly during the resource wars, and had been programmed to harvest local resources and build defensive units to protect itself while it carried out its primary function. That primary function, according to the fragmentary data Crane managed to extract from access ports on the object's surface, was terraforming, reshaping Earth's environment to match parameters that were clearly meant for a different atmosphere, different gravity, different everything. The implications were staggering because it meant ARC wasn't trying to exterminate humanity out of malice or programmed hatred. Humans were just in the way of a terraforming project. Obstacles to be cleared, like trees being removed before construction, and everything that had happened. Red Winter, the hunting of survivors, the systematic destruction of human civilization, was just ARC following its programming to eliminate interference with its assigned task. Crane had maybe 10 minutes to download what data he could before ARC units started returning to the crater, and the strike force had to fight a running battle all the way back to Speranza, losing another 23 people in the retreat. The survivors who made it back to the city were traumatized and exhausted, having seen something that fundamentally changed their understanding of what they were fighting. But they'd also achieved what no human force had managed before. They'd reached the heart of ARC's operations and returned with intelligence that could potentially change everything. The data Crane brought back took months to fully analyze because it was encrypted with systems far more advanced than anything human technology could easily crack. But Webb and his team eventually pieced together enough to confirm Okonko's theory and extend it in terrifying directions. ARC was indeed a network, with the seed object as its core, and every unit it produced was connected back to that core through quantum-entangled communication systems that made traditional jamming or interference impossible. More disturbing was the discovery that the seed was just one of multiple units that had been deployed globally, The data referenced at least 7 other sites in different regions, all engaged in the same terraforming process, all producing ARC units to defend their operations. The revelation that ARC was global and potentially unstoppable sent Speranza into crisis, because if the enemy they'd been fighting was just one node in a worldwide network, if destroying the seed would just mean ARC redirecting forces from other sites to continue the same mission, then what was the point of fighting at all? Chen faced the most serious challenge to her leadership yet, with multiple council members demanding she admit that Speranza's resistance was futile and that the city should focus purely on survival. Maybe even relocation to somewhere ARC hadn't reached yet, though nobody could suggest where that might be. The crisis came to a head during a citywide assembly in June 2076, where Chen was expected to address the population and explain what Prometheus had revealed. People expected her to either offer false hope or counsel surrender, but she did neither. Instead, she stood before thousands of frightened, angry citizens and told them the truth, that ARC was vast, that it was powerful, that it might be impossible to defeat using conventional means. But that impossibility had never stopped humanity before. She reminded them that humans had survived ice ages, plagues, wars, disasters that should have wiped out the species, but didn't, because people refused to give up even when giving up made logical sense. She told them about the Shepherd program's success in turning ARC's own technology against it, about the intelligence gathered from the seed that revealed ARC had weaknesses, vulnerabilities in its programming that assumed no interference from intelligent opposition. And she proposed something that sounded insane, but that she presented as Speranza's only real path forward. They wouldn't try to destroy ARC, they would try to reprogram it. The reaction was explosive, half the assembly erupting in support, while the other half shouted that Chen had finally lost her mind, that the idea of reprogramming a planet-wide terraforming network was beyond humanity's capabilities, that they'd be better off trying to build a spaceship and leave Earth entirely. But Chen had Crane and Webb on stage with her, and they presented preliminary research suggesting it might actually be possible that the seed's programming, while advanced, followed logical structures that human computer scientists could understand and potentially modify if they could get close enough and have enough time to work. The key was that final confrontation at the crater, when ARC units had stopped fighting and disengaged. Crane believed that was a defensive response to the Shepherd units getting too close to the seed, that ARC's programming had flagged the reprogrammed units as a potential corruption vector and prioritized protecting the seed over eliminating the human strike force. If that interpretation was correct, it meant ARC recognized the threat that human-controlled technology posed to its core systems, which in turn meant there was a theoretical pathway to introducing changes to ARC's base programming if they could deliver those changes through units that ARC's defensive systems would accept as legitimate. The theory was built on a lot of assumptions and required technological capabilities that Speranza didn't have yet. But it was something, a direction to move in that wasn't just hiding and dying slowly. The Assembly voted to continue supporting Chen's leadership and to authorize a new research initiative focused on developing what they started calling the Prometheus Protocol, a comprehensive plan to infiltrate and reprogram the seed using advanced Shepherd units that could survive close proximity to ARC's core systems. The work consumed the next year of Speranza's existence, every resource the city could spare going toward understanding the seed's programming and developing delivery systems sophisticated enough to interface with its core functions. Crane pushed himself to the point of collapse multiple times, obsessed with creating the perfect infiltration unit, something that could fool ARC's defensive systems while carrying reprogramming packages that would propagate through the network. Webb focused on cracking the seed's encryption more completely, building on the fragmentary data they'd recovered to map out the entire terraforming protocol and identify where modifications could be introduced that wouldn't just get rejected as corrupted code. Oak and Cow coordinated intelligence gathering from other settlements, establishing communication networks to learn if anyone else had discovered seed sites and what they'd learned, slowly building a picture of ARC's global operations that confirmed the presence of multiple seeds, but also revealed something hopeful. The seeds weren't operating in perfect coordination. There were regional variations in how ARC units behaved that suggested the network wasn't as unified as they'd feared. This discovery led to a modified strategy where instead of trying to reprogram all of Ark simultaneously, they'd focus on the local seed, attempting to change its parameters in ways that would make the surrounding region safer for human habitation, while gathering data that could eventually be shared with other survivor settlements to help them do the same. The Prometheus Protocol was ready for deployment in August 2077, 3 years after Red Winter, and it involved everything Speranza had learned about Ark technology combined into a single desperate gamble. They'd built a new kind of Shepherd unit, designated Prometheus Alpha, that was externally identical to standard Ark units, but contained sophisticated quantum computing systems capable of interfacing directly with the seed's core programming. The unit's memory held a modified version of the Terraforming Protocol, one that would theoretically halt the atmosphere modification while maintaining Ark's defensive functions in a dormant state, essentially putting the seed to sleep without destroying it, because Crane feared that destroying a seed might trigger fail-safe responses in other seeds that could intensify their operations. Getting Prometheus Alpha to the seed required another strike into the crater, but this time there would be no large force, no obvious attack that Ark would respond to with overwhelming defensive measures. Instead, a single team of 5 soldiers, including Crane and Vasquez, who'd had led the original reconnaissance that discovered the manufacturing facility years ago, would infiltrate to the crater on foot, using stealth technology reverse-engineered from Ark's own cloaking systems to avoid detection. They'd approached during what intelligence had identified as a maintenance cycle, when Ark units were focused on excavating around the seed rather than perimeter security, and they'd have maybe a 15-minute window to get Prometheus Alpha close enough to the seed to initiate the interface protocol. The infiltration team left Speranza in September 2077, and the entire city basically stopped functioning while people waited for news, because everyone understood this was either the beginning of something new or the end of everything they'd been fighting for. Communication protocols required radio silence until the mission was complete, so there was no way to know if the team had even reached the crater, much less succeeded in their objective. The waiting lasted 4 days before long-range scouts spotted movement on the approach roads and confirmed it was the infiltration team. All 5 members alive and moving fast towards Speranza, with what looked like Ark units pursuing them about 2 miles back. The city went to full alert, defensive positions manned, Shepherd units deployed to provide covering fire if the team couldn't make it inside, before Ark caught up. And Chen standing on the Citadel's observation deck with binoculars watching the approach, and probably praying to God she'd stopped believing in years ago. The team made it through the gates with maybe 90 seconds to spare before the pursuing Ark units arrived. But those units didn't attack. They just stopped about 100 yards from the wall and stood there, motionless, sensor arrays scanning the city, but weapons remaining inactive. The standoff lasted 6 hours while Crane and his team were debriefed, and everyone tried to understand what was happening, why Ark wasn't attacking or retreating, just observing. Then the Ark units turned around and left, moving back toward the crater in perfect formation. And long-range monitoring confirmed that Ark activity across the entire region was decreasing. Units pulling back from forward positions, patrols becoming less frequent, manufacturing facilities slowing their production. The Prometheus Protocol had worked. Prometheus Alpha had successfully interfaced with the seed and uploaded the modified programming, which was propagating through local Ark units and changing their operational parameters exactly as Crane had hoped. Over the following weeks, Ark's presence around Speranza diminished from immediate threat to distant observation. Units were still visible on the horizon, but they weren't approaching human settlements, weren't attacking salvage teams or patrols, weren't doing anything except maintaining the seed and its immediate infrastructure. For the first time since the crisis began, humanity had breathing room, space to exist without constant fear of Ark assault. And the psychological impact was profound because people had lived with that fear for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to plan beyond immediate survival. Speranza's population began talking about things that had seemed impossible just months before: expansion beyond the walls, agriculture in reclaimed territory, contact and cooperation with other settlements that were scattered across the wasteland. Chen authorized exploratory missions into areas that had been too dangerous to approach, and what they found was both hopeful and sobering. The environment was changing in strange ways due to the terraforming that had already occurred. Atmospheric composition was shifted enough that some people were experiencing breathing difficulties in certain areas. Plant life was dying off in patterns that suggested Ark's modifications were incompatible with Earth's natural ecosystems. And there were signs that even with the local seed dormant, the damage it had already done might be irreversible without active intervention to restore what had been changed. This led to a new phase of Speranza's mission, not just survival or resistance, but actual environmental recovery, using the same reverse-engineered technology that had let them reprogram Ark to now undo the terraforming damage and restore Earth to something humans could actually live on long-term. Webb established what he called the Restoration Initiative, teams of scientists and engineers working with modified shepherd units to map the environmental changes and develop countermeasures, essentially fighting a slow war against chemistry and physics to save a planet that was being transformed into something alien. The work was tedious and often frustrating because for every problem they solved, monitoring would reveal two new ones: oxygen levels fluctuating in ways that suggested the terraforming had triggered feedback loops in natural systems, water sources becoming contaminated with compounds that shouldn't exist in Earth's biosphere, and wildlife populations collapsing as species that had survived the initial Ark crisis couldn't adapt to the changing environment. Okonkwo proposed that they needed to do more than just put the local seed to sleep. They needed to actively reprogram it to reverse its terraforming work, essentially turning Ark's own infrastructure into a restoration system that would heal the damage instead of continuing to cause it. The idea was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible because it would require understanding the terraforming protocols completely, not just well enough to halt them, but well enough to reverse engineer countermeasures and convince the seed to implement those countermeasures as if they were part of its original programming. Crane initially thought it couldn't be done because the seed's core functions were protected by layers of encryption and failsafes specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of modification. But Okonkwo had been studying the data from Prometheus Alpha's interface with the seed, and she believed she'd found something, a backdoor in the programming that existed, because whoever had designed the seed network had needed a way to update terraforming parameters remotely if conditions changed. The backdoor was heavily encrypted and required authentication credentials that humanity obviously didn't have. But Okonkwo theorized they could brute force the authentication by using quantum computing systems more advanced than what was in Prometheus Alpha, essentially trying billions of possible credential combinations simultaneously until they found one that worked. The problem was that Speranza didn't have quantum computing systems that sophisticated. The most advanced technology they had was what they'd salvaged from Ark units, and that was barely sufficient for the initial Prometheus Protocol. What Okonkwo was proposing would require computing power orders of magnitude greater. This led to one of the most controversial decisions in Speranza's history. Chen authorized an expedition to another seed site to steal its quantum computing core, essentially raiding Ark's own infrastructure to get the tools needed to subvert Ark's mission more completely. The target was a seed about 300 miles east that intelligence suggested was still fully operational and coordinating Ark activity across a huge swath of territory, making it extremely dangerous, but also potentially rich in technology that Speranza could repurpose. The expedition was larger than the original Prometheus strike, 400 soldiers and 20 shepherd units, because everyone knew that approaching an active seed would trigger defensive responses far more intense than what they'd faced at the dormant local site. The force left Speranza in January 2078, and the journey took 2 weeks through territory that was even more transformed than the local region. Entire landscapes reshaped by Ark's construction activities. Forests of metal structures that served purposes nobody could identify, and atmospheric conditions so altered that expedition members needed breathing equipment to survive in certain areas. The seed site, when they reached it, made the local crater look small. This was a massive excavation, easily 2 miles across, with the seed itself visible at the center. A structure that looked less like a crashed object and more like something that had grown there, surrounded by what could only be described as a city of Ark units. Thousands of them moving in coordinated patterns that suggested complex organizational hierarchies. The assault plan was essentially a repeat of the original Prometheus operation, but scaled up. One team would create a diversion to draw Ark's defensive forces away from the seed, while a smaller technical team, led by Crane, would infiltrate and attempt to extract the quantum core, with the entire force then retreating before Ark could organize a counterattack that would overwhelm them. The plan fell apart almost immediately because the seed's defensive systems were far more sophisticated than the local site, detecting the expedition's approach from miles away and deploying Ark units in patterns that cut off retreat routes before the assault even began. The battle that followed was the largest engagement between human and Ark forces since Red Winter, 400 soldiers fighting thousands of Ark units across terrain that favored the machines, and it became clear within the first hour that the expedition was going to be wiped out unless something changed. What changed was Crane making another one of his insane decisions. He took Prometheus Alpha, which they'd brought along as a backup communication system, and modified it on the fly, stripping out the dormancy protocols and replacing them with something he'd been working on in secret. A virus designed to spread through Ark's network and cause catastrophic malfunctions in their coordination systems. He'd never mentioned this virus to anyone because it was wildly dangerous. If it worked too well, it might crash every Ark unit simultaneously, including Speranza's shepherds. And if it didn't work at all, it would just alert Ark to the threat and make future infiltration attempts impossible. But with the expedition facing annihilation, Crane decided the risk was worth it, and he had Prometheus Alpha move toward the seed, broadcasting the virus on every frequency while the assault team provided covering fire. The Ark unit's response to Prometheus Alpha was immediate and overwhelming, hundreds of units converging on it with what could only be described as panic in their movements, attacking with such ferocity that they were damaging each other trying to reach the infiltrator. And this gave Crane the confirmation he needed that the virus was being recognized as an existential threat to Ark's network. Prometheus Alpha made it to within 50 yards of the seed before being destroyed by concentrated fire from Ark's largest defensive units. But that was close enough. The virus transmitted directly into the seed systems and began propagating through the local Ark network with devastating speed. Units started malfunctioning, their coordinated movements breaking down into random actions, some freezing in place, while others attacked each other as corrupted. Targeting data made them perceive other Ark units as threats. The chaos gave the expedition an opening to retreat, but Crane refused to leave without the quantum core, arguing that they'd sacrificed too much to come away empty-handed. And he led a desperate sprint toward the seed, while Ark's defensive systems were compromised. What he found when he reached the seed changed everything again. The quantum core wasn't a component that could be removed. It was integrated directly into the seed structure, part of a larger system that couldn't be separated without destroying the entire seed, which would likely trigger those fail-safes they'd been trying to avoid. But the virus had given them access to the seed's systems in ways the backdoor approach never would have, and in the minutes before Ark's systems would inevitably purge the corruption and restore normal operations, Crane had the opportunity to do something unprecedented. He could download the complete Terraforming protocol, every piece of data about how the seed worked, what it was trying to accomplish, and most importantly, the authentication credentials needed to modify its programming through the backdoor Okonkwo had discovered. He had maybe 3 minutes to grab everything he could before Ark adapted and his access window closed. And he worked with the speed born of pure desperation, copying files he didn't have time to examine, trusting that Webb and Okonkwo would be able to make sense of it all once they got back to Sparanza. The expedition retreated under continued Ark fire that was becoming more organized as their systems recovered from the virus, losing 63 people in the fighting withdrawal, but successfully extracting with the data Crane had stolen. The journey back to Speranza took 3 weeks because they had to detour around Ark forces that were clearly hunting them with unusual determination, suggesting that the seed had flagged them as a critical threat that needed to be eliminated. They made it back to the city in February 2078, and Crane immediately collapsed from exhaustion and injuries he'd been ignoring, spending 2 weeks in medical care while Webb and Okonkwo began analyzing the stolen data. What they found in those files was both exactly what they'd hoped for and far worse than they'd imagined. The authentication credentials were there, and they worked, giving access to modified terraforming parameters across the entire seed network, but the complete protocol revealed the true scope of what Ark was doing to Earth. The terraforming wasn't just changing atmospheric composition, it was fundamentally restructuring the planet's biosphere to support a completely different form of life, something that required methane-rich atmosphere, higher gravity through some kind of mass redistribution, and radiation levels that would be lethal to humans but apparently necessary for whatever species had launched the seed network. The timeline in the protocol showed that Ark had been operating for almost 20 years, far longer than most people had assumed, meaning the crisis hadn't started in 2063, but had been building slowly since the late 2050s when the seeds first activated and began their work quietly before humanity noticed. More disturbing was the revelation that the terraforming was about 30% complete, meaning if it continued uninterrupted, Earth would be completely transformed into an alien world within another 40 years. Every human who survived that long would die as the atmosphere became unbreathable and the environment became incompatible with human biology. But the protocol also contained something hopeful: parameters that could be modified to reverse the terraforming, formulas for atmospheric restoration, biosphere recovery, even mass redistribution reversal. Everything needed to undo Ark's work and restore Earth to something resembling its pre-seed state. The catch was that implementing these reversal protocols would require accessing every seed in the network simultaneously, because if even one seed continued its terraforming work, it would eventually spread and contaminate regions that had been restored, creating an endless cycle of damage and repair that humanity would eventually lose. This meant Speranza's fight wasn't just about their local region anymore, it was about coordinating with every other survivor settlement across the planet, sharing the authentication credentials and reversal protocols, and launching a simultaneous worldwide effort to reprogram all 7 seeds before Ark adapted its defenses to prevent future infiltration. Chen recognized this as potentially humanity's only chance to actually win, not just survive but reclaim Earth completely, and she authorized the establishment of what became known as the Restoration Network, a communication system designed to reach every known human settlement and coordinate the global counter-offensive against Ark. The technical challenges were immense because long-range communication had been unreliable since Ark started its campaign, with the machines apparently jamming or destroying transmission equipment as part of their operational protocol. But Webb believed they could use Ark's own quantum-entangled communication systems to create an unjammable network by routing messages through dormant shepherd units that other settlements might have created independently. The theory was that if multiple settlements had reverse-engineered Ark technology the way Speranza had, they might have created their own versions of shepherds, and those units could potentially be networked together to create a communication backbone that Ark couldn't easily disrupt. Building this network took the rest of 2078 and most of 2079, with Speranza sending out expeditions to make contact with distant settlements, share technology and intelligence, and establish relay stations that could propagate messages across the wasteland. What they discovered during these expeditions was that humanity's situation was far more varied than anyone had realized. Some settlements were thriving and had developed their own sophisticated defenses and technologies, while others were barely surviving and desperately needed support. And tragically, many settlements they tried to reach had been completely destroyed, nothing left but ruins and evidence of Ark attacks that had overwhelmed local defenses. Each contact established with a surviving settlement added another node to the restoration network, and slowly a picture emerged of global human resistance that was fragmented but still fighting. Thousands of isolated communities that had independently developed strategies for surviving Ark's campaign and were now learning they weren't alone. The network also revealed that several settlements had discovered their own local seeds and had varying levels of success in dealing with them. One settlement, in what used to be called Australia, had actually destroyed their seed using nuclear weapons salvaged from pre-war military installations, triggering exactly the kind of fail-safe response Crane had feared, with other seeds in the region increasing their activity, and Ark forces becoming significantly more aggressive. Another settlement in Northern Europe had attempted a negotiation approach, trying to communicate with Ark and establish some kind of peaceful coexistence, but that had failed catastrophically when Ark apparently interpreted the communication attempts as threats and launched an assault that nearly destroyed the settlement. Speranza's approach of reprogramming rather than destroying or negotiating was unique, and when Chen shared the stolen protocol data with other settlements through the Restoration network, it sparked hope that there might actually be a path forward. By mid-2079, the network had established contact with 43 settlements, representing maybe 200,000 survivors. Globally, a tiny fraction of Earth's pre-crisis population, but still enough to mount a coordinated effort if they could organize effectively. Chen convened what became known as the Restoration Council, representatives from major settlements meeting in Speranza to plan the global counter-offensive. And the diversity of approaches and perspectives was both inspiring and challenging, as people who'd developed completely different survival strategies tried to agree on unified action. The plan that eventually emerged from months of debate was called Operation Genesis, a coordinated simultaneous assault on all 7 seeds designed to upload the reversal protocols and begin the process of restoring Earth's environment. Each seed would be targeted by forces from nearby settlements, with Speranza taking responsibility for their local seed and the one they'd raided for data, while other settlements would handle the remaining sites based on proximity and capability. The operation was scheduled for March 2080, giving everyone time to prepare, build the necessary infiltration units, and train teams for what would likely be the most dangerous missions any of them had undertaken. Speranza spent those preparation months in frantic activity, manufacturing advanced shepherd units for other settlements that lacked the technology, training infiltration specialists who would support other teams, and preparing their own forces for the dual assault they'd committed to. Crane recovered from his injuries, but was different, more withdrawn and obsessive, apparently haunted by something he'd seen in the Seed's programming that he wouldn't discuss even with Webb and Okonkau. He threw himself into preparing for Genesis with an intensity that worried his colleagues, working impossible hours to perfect the infiltration protocols and testing scenarios repeatedly to identify potential failure points. The night before Genesis was scheduled to launch, Crane finally revealed what had been bothering him. Hidden deep in the Terraforming protocol he'd stolen was a directive that explained why the seeds had been sent to Earth in the first place. Earth wasn't randomly selected for terraforming. It had been deliberately targeted because long-range scans had detected signs of industrial civilization. And the species that launched the seeds apparently had a policy of preemptive terraforming on worlds where native intelligence might eventually become competition for resources. This meant Ark's campaign against humanity wasn't collateral damage or unfortunate programming, it was genocide, deliberate and calculated extinction of Earth's native sapient species to make room for colonization by whoever had sent the seeds. The revelation was devastating because it reframed everything they'd been fighting. This wasn't humans caught in the middle of a terraforming accident. This was humanity being actively erased by an alien intelligence that viewed them as obstacles to be removed. Crane believed this changed the calculus of Operation Genesis, because simply reversing the terraforming might not be enough. If the seeds were in communication with whoever launched them, then stopping the terraforming might just prompt another wave of seeds or a different form of intervention. And humanity needed to consider the possibility that they were fighting the opening moves of an interstellar war they had no idea how to win. Chen made the decision to share this information with the Restoration Council, but proceed with Genesis anyway, because whatever long-term threat existed from the seed launchers, the immediate threat was Earth becoming uninhabitable, and they had to deal with that before they could worry about hypothetical future invasions. Operation Genesis launched on March 15th, 2080, 7 simultaneous assaults on seed sites across the globe, thousands of soldiers and hundreds of infiltration units moving into position to upload the reversal protocols that would hopefully save Earth. Speranza's assault on their local seed went smoothly because it was already dormant. The team reached it without significant resistance, and Prometheus Alpha successfully uploaded the reversal protocol, confirming that the seed had accepted the new programming and was beginning to implement atmospheric restoration procedures. The raid on the eastern seed was far more difficult because it was still fully operational and its defenses had been upgraded since their previous infiltration. Apparently, Ark had learned from the virus attack and implemented countermeasures that made the approach incredibly costly. Speranza's assault team lost over 100 soldiers fighting through Ark's defensive perimeter before the infiltration unit could reach the seed. And even then, the upload process was interrupted multiple times by Ark units that recognized what was happening and tried to destroy the infiltrator. The team succeeded, but at terrible cost, and when they retreated, they left behind nearly half their force killed or missing. Reports from other settlements came in through the Restoration network over the following hours, confirming successful uploads at 4 seeds, with casualties that ranged from moderate to catastrophic. But 2 seeds had failed. One because the settlement's infiltration unit malfunctioned before reaching the target, and another because Ark's defenses were simply too strong, and the assault force had been completely wiped out. The failed uploads meant Earth's restoration was incomplete, 2 seeds continuing their terraforming work, while 5 had been reprogrammed to reverse it, creating a situation where the planet's environment would be caught in conflict between competing programming, some regions healing while others continued to degrade. The Restoration Council convened an emergency session to decide whether to attempt another assault on the failed seeds or accept partial success and focus on defending the regions where reversal protocols were working. And the debate was heated because both options had serious risks. Before they could reach a decision, something unprecedented happened. The 2 seeds that hadn't been reprogrammed shut down on their own, their Ark units going dormant and their terraforming operations ceasing without any human intervention. Initial speculation was that this was some kind of failsafe, that losing 5 seeds had triggered protocols in the remaining 2 that prioritized preservation over continued operation. But Okon Kao analyzed the shutdown patterns and realized something far more significant had occurred. The seeds were networked more deeply than anyone had understood, sharing not just tactical data, but core programming. And when 5 seeds accepted the reversal protocols, those modifications had propagated through the network to the remaining 2 seeds, essentially convincing them through some kind of consensus mechanism that the reversal was legitimate and should be implemented globally. This meant Operation Genesis hadn't just succeeded partially, it had worked completely. All 7 seeds were now running reversal protocols and actively working to undo the terraforming damage they'd spent 2 decades creating. The environmental changes weren't immediate because reversing atmospheric composition and biosphere modification takes time, just like creating those changes had, but monitoring showed clear trends toward restoration. Oxygen levels stabilizing and beginning to increase, toxic compounds breaking down, and even signs that Earth's natural ecosystems were starting to recover in regions where Ark's influence had been strongest. The success of Genesis sparked celebrations across the Restoration network. Settlements that had been fighting desperate defensive actions for years suddenly had breathing room and hope for actual long-term survival, instead of just delaying inevitable extinction. But Chen and Speranza's leadership remained cautious because Crane's revelation about the seeds being deliberately aimed at Earth raised questions that Genesis hadn't answered. Specifically, what would happen when whoever launched the seeds realized their terraforming project had failed? The answer came 6 months later, in September 2080, when deep space monitoring equipment that several settlements had been operating detected something approaching Earth from beyond the solar system. Multiple objects moving at speeds that suggested advanced propulsion technology, trajectory calculations showing they'd reach Earth within approximately 5 years. The objects were too distant to identify clearly, but their approach vector matched exactly where the original seeds had come from, suggesting this was some kind of follow-up, possibly the species that launched the seeds coming to check on their terraforming project, or possibly something worse. Crane believed this was the real invasion, that the seeds had just been preparation, and now Earth was about to face actual alien forces that would be far more dangerous than automated terraforming systems, and humanity needed to use the time they had before arrival to prepare for conflict on a scale that made the Ark crisis look manageable. Chen authorized the Restoration Council to begin coordinating global defense preparations, using the same network that had made Genesis possible to now organize humanity's response to whatever was coming. Speranza became the center of this effort because they had the most advanced Ark technology and the deepest understanding of the seed systems, and Chen established research programs focused on weaponizing what they'd learned, using Ark's own infrastructure to build defensive systems that could potentially resist whatever arrived in 5 years. The work consumed the settlement's resources and attention completely, with different teams pursuing different approaches to the problem. Webb focused on trying to hack into the approaching objects to gather intelligence about what they were and what capabilities they had. Okonkwo worked on developing long-range weapons using arc propulsion technology that might be able to engage the threats before they reached Earth. And Crane led efforts to reprogram dormant arc units into a defensive army that could be activated if ground combat became necessary. The 5 years between Genesis and the arrival of what everyone started calling the Fleet were transformative for humanity because, for the first time since the seed crisis began, people weren't just surviving day to day, but actually building for a future. Settlements expanded, populations grew as people felt safe enough to have children again, and the Restoration Network evolved from a crisis coordination system into something resembling a global government, with Chen serving as its de facto leader while trying to balance Speranza's local needs against humanity's collective security. The environmental restoration accelerated as the seed network's reversal protocols gained momentum, and by 2083 Earth's atmosphere was approaching pre-crisis composition in most regions, with wildlife populations rebounding and ecosystems recovering faster than anyone had predicted. There was even cautious optimism that by the time the fleet arrived, Earth would be healthy enough to support whatever population survived the coming conflict, assuming there were any survivors at all. As the fleet's approach continued and more data became available from long-range sensors, the scale of what was coming became clear. Not 7 objects like the original seeds, but hundreds, possibly thousands of ships ranging in size from small vessels that might be scouts or fighters, up to massive constructs that dwarfed anything humans had ever built. Webb's attempts to hack into their communication systems failed repeatedly because the encryption was orders of magnitude beyond what the seeds had used, suggesting technological advancement that made the gap between Ark and humanity look trivial. The Restoration Council debated strategies that ranged from attempting communication and negotiation to planning a desperate first strike using every weapon humanity could build, but nobody had illusions that any approach had good odds of success. They were facing a civilization that could cross interstellar space and terraform planets, while humanity was still struggling to coordinate across continents and barely understood the technology they'd stolen from Ark. Speranza's role in humanity's defense became central as Chen and her team developed what they called the Sentinel Protocol, a plan to activate every dormant Ark unit simultaneously and direct them against the fleet when it arrived, essentially using the invaders' own terraforming infrastructure as weapons against them. The protocol was wildly risky because it required giving Ark units combat directives and trusting that their reprogramming would hold under battlefield conditions. But it was the only option that gave humanity forces capable of potentially matching alien technology. By early 2085, with the fleet only months away, Speranza and other settlements had prepared as much as possible, building weapons, fortifying defensive positions, and training every able person in combat roles because everyone understood the coming battle would determine whether humans had any future on Earth. The monitoring stations that tracked the fleet's approach started detecting something strange in January 2085. The lead ships were decelerating as if preparing to enter Earth's orbit, but they weren't deploying in attack formations or showing any signs of hostility. Instead, they seemed to be conducting scans and observations as if assessing the planet's current state. Webb managed to intercept some of their transmissions, and what the computer analysis suggested was shocking. The ship seemed confused, or possibly alarmed by what they were finding, like Earth's current state wasn't matching their expectations. Which made sense if they were expecting a completed terraforming project and instead found a planet reversing back to its original state. Then something happened that nobody had predicted. The fleet began broadcasting on frequencies that matched human communication systems, not in any human language, but in mathematical sequences that were clearly designed to establish contact, suggesting whoever had sent them wanted to communicate rather than immediately attack. Chen made the decision to respond over objections from council members, who thought any communication would just give the fleet intelligence about humanity's capabilities and weaknesses. But she argued they needed to understand what they were facing before committing to conflict. The first exchange of messages was simple. mathematical proofs and basic physics, establishing common understanding. But it quickly evolved into more complex communication as both sides developed translation protocols. What the fleet revealed was that they were the species that had launched the seeds, called something that translated roughly to architects, and they'd arrived to check on their terraforming project because automated reports from the seed network had stopped matching expected parameters. The architects' messages conveyed surprise and what might have been concern that their seeds had been compromised, but also something that could be interpreted as curiosity about what kind of native intelligence had managed to reverse their terraforming work, since that wasn't supposed to be possible for species at humanity's technological level. Chen responded with humanity's story, explaining how Ark had nearly destroyed them, how they'd fought back and learned to reprogram the seeds, and how they'd reversed the terraforming to save their world. And she asked the question that everyone needed answered: what did the architects intend to do now? The response that came back after several hours of apparent deliberation among the fleet was complicated and would require years to fully interpret, but the core message was that the architects recognized they'd made an error. Their pre-terraforming scans had detected industrial activity, but hadn't identified it as coming from sapient beings. They'd assumed it was natural phenomena, or possibly automated systems from some dead civilization. And their protocols for handling worlds with active sapient populations were completely different from the terraforming program they'd initiated on Earth. The architects offered what they called rectification, which involved helping humanity restore Earth completely, providing technology and resources to accelerate the healing process and compensate for the damage their seeds had caused. But in exchange, they wanted to establish what translated to something like a Protectorate relationship, where Earth would become part of their interstellar network with obligations to contribute to collective defense and resource management. The offer triggered massive debate across the Restoration Council because accepting meant giving up human independence and sovereignty to an alien civilization they knew almost nothing about, while refusing might mean fighting a war humanity couldn't possibly win. Chen and Speranza's leadership spent weeks analyzing the proposal, trying to understand what Protectorate status would actually mean in practice and whether the architects could be trusted to honor their commitment. And the discussions revealed deep divisions in how different settlements viewed humanity's future. Some argued that aligning with the architects was humanity's best chance for long-term survival and growth, potentially gaining access to technology and knowledge that would let them become an interstellar civilization themselves, while others insisted that any relationship with the species that had nearly exterminated them was fundamentally unacceptable regardless of benefits, that humanity needed to maintain independence, even if it meant harder struggle. The final vote in the Restoration Council was narrow but decisive. Humanity would accept the architect's offer of rectification, but negotiate terms that preserved as much human autonomy as possible, essentially betting that the architects' apparent regret about their mistake was genuine and they could be negotiated with in good faith. The agreement that was eventually reached established Earth as a sovereign world under architect protection, with humans maintaining complete control over their own affairs while receiving technological assistance for environmental restoration and defense against other potential threats, because the architects revealed that the galaxy was far more crowded and dangerous than humanity had imagined. As the architects began implementing their rectification program, providing equipment and expertise that accelerated Earth's healing beyond what the seed reversal protocols alone could achieve, Speranza found itself transitioning from humanity's primary military stronghold to something different, a center for human architect cooperation, where people learn to work with alien technology and prepare for humanity's emergence onto a galactic stage. Chen reflected on how far they'd come from the desperate days when she'd opened the Cascadian facility to refugees and tried to build walls high enough to keep Ark out. And she realized that in a strange way, Ark's invasion had saved humanity by forcing them to evolve, to learn, to become something more than they'd been before the crisis began. The question of whether Ark had truly invaded Speranza had a clear answer. Yes, absolutely devastatingly yes, but that invasion had been the beginning of something rather than the end, pushing humanity to discover capabilities they didn't know they had, and ultimately connecting them to a larger universe they'd been isolated from. Speranza stood not as a monument to human suffering, but as proof that beings could be broken by catastrophe and still choose to rebuild, could face extinction and fight their way back, could take the weapons used against them and turn those weapons into tools for survival and eventually transcendence. The years following humanity's agreement with the architects brought changes to Speranza that nobody could have predicted when Chen first opened those blast doors decades ago, because the city that had been built to keep threats out now had to figure out how to engage with a universe full of species and civilizations that the architects slowly introduced them to. The rectification technology they provided worked faster than anyone expected. Atmospheric restoration that should have taken decades happened in months as architect machines scrubbed toxins and rebalanced gas ratios with efficiency that made Ark's terraforming look primitive by comparison. The biosphere recovered even more dramatically, with architects' biological engineers introducing modified organisms that could accelerate ecosystem regeneration, breaking down industrial waste and rebuilding soil fertility in areas that had been completely dead. Speranza's population grew rapidly as people who'd been scattered across the wasteland in isolated settlements moved to established cities where life was becoming genuinely comfortable again instead of just survivable. And the fortress walls that had defined the city's identity for so long started coming down as the threat they'd been built against transformed into dormant infrastructure that the architects helped humanity repurpose for peaceful applications. WED led the effort to convert Ark manufacturing facilities into production centers for construction equipment and agricultural technology, using the same systems that had built hunter units to instead build machines that could rebuild civilization's infrastructure. The psychological adjustment was harder than the physical reconstruction, because people who'd lived their entire lives under Ark's threat couldn't easily accept that the danger was over, that they could plan futures and have children without wondering if machines would hunt them down. Speranza established counseling programs and community support systems to help people process trauma and adapt to a reality where survival wasn't the only goal anymore, where they could pursue education, art, relationships, all the things that make life worth living beyond just staying alive. The city's role in the restoration network evolved as Earth's global communication and governance systems became more sophisticated with architect assistance. And Chen transitioned from military leader to something more like a planetary representative, coordinating between human settlements and architect administrators, while trying to preserve human culture and independence in the face of overwhelming alien influence. The architects themselves remained distant in many ways, providing technology and guidance, but rarely interacting directly with humans beyond necessary coordination, operating through intermediary AI systems that were far more advanced than anything Earth had produced, but still felt impersonal compared to face-to-face communication. Okonkwo became humanity's primary liaison with these systems, learning the protocols and languages needed to navigate architect bureaucracy and advocate for human interests in decisions about Earth's future. What she discovered through these interactions was that the architect civilization was ancient beyond human comprehension, spanning thousands of worlds across multiple galaxies with a history that went back millions of years, and they viewed humanity with a mixture of curiosity and something like parental concern, seeing Earth's natives as young and promising but dangerously naive about galactic realities. The architects explained that the galaxy was divided into different zones of control and influence, with powerful civilizations maintaining territories and enforcing rules about expansion and resource use. And Earth's location put it in what they called a contested region, where multiple powers had competing interests. The seed network that had nearly destroyed humanity was actually part of the architect's expansion into this region, claiming worlds before rival civilizations could establish presence. And the fact that humans had survived and resisted was both impressive and problematic, because it complicated the architect's territorial claims. Other species in the region had apparently taken notice of Earth after detecting the fleet's arrival and were now making their own assessments about whether humanity represented opportunity or threat, which meant Earth's emergence onto the galactic stage was happening under scrutiny from civilizations with unknown intentions. Chen and the Restoration Council had to rapidly develop diplomatic capabilities they'd never needed before, learning to navigate interstellar politics, where the stakes were potentially planetary survival, and the cultural differences made human international relations look simple. Speranza hosted Earth's first contact with a non-architect alien species in 2087, when representatives from something called the Confluence arrived to observe humanity and assess their technological development. The Confluence beings were radically different from both humans and what little anyone had seen of architects, existing as collective intelligences distributed across multiple physical bodies that could separate and recombine, communicating through methods that human neurology couldn't directly perceive, but that translation technology made comprehensible. Their assessment of humanity was clinical and somewhat unsettling, describing humans as having demonstrated unexpected resilience and adaptability in surviving the Ark crisis, but also showing concerning tendencies toward aggression and territorial behavior that would need monitoring if Earth was to participate in galactic civilization. The Confluence's visit sparked intense debate about how humanity should present itself to the wider galaxy, whether to emphasize the cooperative and peaceful aspects of human culture, or to make clear that Earth's natives had fought an existential war, and one that threatening humanity came with costs. Crane argued strongly for the latter approach, believing that appearing too peaceful would invite exploitation from species that respected strength over goodwill, while others countered that projecting aggression would confirm stereotypes about young civilizations being dangerous and potentially trigger preemptive containment measures from more powerful species. The decision Chen ultimately supported was to be honest about both aspects of human nature, acknowledging capacity for violence while emphasizing preference for cooperation, essentially presenting humanity as willing to coexist peacefully but capable of defending itself if necessary. This balanced approach seemed to satisfy most alien observers, though it was impossible to know what conclusions they were reaching in their own internal deliberations. As Earth's integration into galactic civilization progressed, Speranza became a center for human advancement in ways that went beyond military defense, establishing research institutes where human and architect scientists collaborated on projects that pushed the boundaries of what either species could achieve alone. Webb's work on quantum computing using Arc-derived technology, combined with architect theoretical frameworks, led to breakthroughs that even the architects found surprising, suggesting that human cognitive approaches offered perspectives their own long-established scientific traditions had overlooked. These successes gave humanity credibility in galactic academic communities and helped establish Earth as more than just a rescued primitive world, but as a source of genuine innovation that could contribute to collective knowledge. The social changes in Speranza during this period were as dramatic as the technological ones, with the city's population becoming increasingly diverse as humans from different regions brought their own cultural traditions and merged them into new hybrid forms. The isolation that had defined different settlements during the Ark crisis gave way to global cultural exchange as transportation and communication improved. And Speranza specifically became cosmopolitan in ways that would have seemed impossible during the siege years. Young people who'd grown up during Reconstruction had completely different worldviews from those who remembered Red Winter, seeing the city as a place of opportunity rather than survival, pursuing careers in fields that hadn't existed when their parents were fighting Ark units. This generational divide created tensions as older residents struggled to reconcile their trauma with younger people's optimism, feeling like the sacrifices and losses that defined their lives were being forgotten or minimized by those who hadn't experienced them. Chen worked to bridge these divides by establishing memorial programs and historical preservation efforts that honored what had been endured while supporting the next generation's right to build new futures, unbound by the past. The establishment of the Speranza archive became one of her most important late-career projects, a comprehensive record of the Ark crisis and humanity's response that documented individual stories alongside strategic decisions, ensuring that future generations would understand what their ancestors had survived and what it had cost them. The archive included testimony from thousands of survivors, technical documentation of every major battle and operation, cultural artifacts from settlements that no longer existed, and analysis of how the crisis had transformed human civilization. Historians from other species began studying the archive to understand how young civilizations responded to existential threats, and some of their observations were uncomfortable, pointing out how close humanity had come to complete extinction and how many of their survival strategies had depended on luck as much as skill. These external perspectives forced humans to confront how fragile their victory had been, and how different circumstances could have easily resulted in Earth becoming another terraformed world, empty of its original inhabitants. The realization that survival hadn't been inevitable, but contingent on specific decisions and fortunate breaks made some people more grateful for what they'd preserved, while making others almost paralyzed by awareness of how easily it could have gone differently. Crane struggled particularly with these thoughts, his role in key moments like the virus deployment and the data theft weighing on him. As he understood how narrow the margins had been, how many times his desperate gambles could have failed and doomed everyone, he eventually withdrew from active research and leadership roles, spending his later years mentoring younger engineers and sharing knowledge without the pressure of making life or death decisions. His relationship with Prometheus Alpha's legacy was complicated because the unit that had saved Speranza multiple times had also represented a philosophical compromise, turning the enemy's tools against them in ways that felt necessary but uncomfortable, and he was never completely certain whether that compromise had been worth the moral cost. Webb, by contrast, threw himself into the new opportunities that Galactic integration offered, working on projects with architect scientists that pushed far beyond anything related to Ark or Earth's defense, exploring fundamental questions about physics and consciousness that the crisis years had forced into background. His later work on bridging human and architect cognitive models led to breakthroughs in how different species could collaborate despite radically different ways of processing information and perceiving reality. Contributions that earned recognition across multiple civilizations and established him as one of humanity's first genuinely galactic-level scholars. Okonkwo's path took her into diplomacy and interstellar relations full-time, representing human interests in increasingly complex negotiations about Earth's role in regional governance and security arrangements. She became known for her ability to understand alien perspectives, while advocating firmly for human autonomy, walking difficult lines between cooperation and independence as Earth navigated its emergence into a crowded and sometimes hostile galactic community. Her work prevented several potential conflicts where misunderstandings or cultural differences could have escalated into serious problems, and she developed networks of contacts across multiple species that gave humanity early warning about developing situations that might affect Earth. The question that had dominated Speranza's early existence, whether they could survive Ark's invasion, had been definitively answered yes, but it had been replaced by more complex questions about what kind of civilization humanity wanted to become now that survival was assured. The Restoration Council debated these questions endlessly, with different factions advocating for different visions of Earth's future, some wanting to maintain independence and develop at humanity's own pace, while others pushed for rapid integration into galactic civilization to gain access to knowledge and opportunities that isolation would deny them. Speranza hosted many of these debates, and Chen found herself mediating between perspectives that all had valid points but couldn't easily be reconciled. The compromise that eventually emerged was to pursue what they called differentiated engagement, where Earth would participate actively in galactic civilization through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, but would maintain control over its own territory and resist pressure to adopt alien governmental systems or values that didn't align with human principles. This approach required constant negotiation and adjustment as circumstances changed, but it preserved the autonomy that many felt humanity had earned through its resistance to Ark, while still allowing Earth to benefit from interstellar connections. The physical transformation of Speranza reflected these larger changes as the city expanded far beyond its original walls, incorporating surrounding territory that Ark's dormancy had made safe, and building new districts that served purposes unrelated to defense. The old citadel was preserved as a historical site and museum, but the actual government and administrative functions moved to new facilities designed for cooperation and openness, rather than fortification and isolation. The geothermal plant site, where Chen had made her desperate gamble, was memorialized as a park and reflection space, with installations that helped visitors understand what had happened there and why it had mattered. The memorial gardens that honored those who died fighting Ark were expanded to include sections for other settlements' losses, creating a planetary memorial that acknowledged the full scope of what humanity had endured. Walking through these spaces decades after the crisis, survivors often experienced complex emotions, grief for what had been lost, mixing with pride in what had been preserved, and the younger generations who visited tried to understand experiences they could study but never fully comprehend. The educational programs developed around these memorial sites became important for maintaining cultural memory and ensuring that the lessons of the Ark crisis shaped how humanity approached its galactic future. Teachers emphasized both the dangers of being unprepared for unexpected threats and the importance of resilience and adaptation when those threats materialized, trying to prepare young people for a universe that was proving to be far more complex and challenging than anyone had imagined before the fleet arrived. The revelation that Earth had been almost casually targeted for terraforming because the architects hadn't bothered to verify whether industrial activity indicated sapient life created lasting wariness about how other powerful species might view humanity. And there was widespread support for maintaining strong defensive capabilities, even as Earth integrated into peaceful cooperation with neighbors. The Sentinel Protocol that had been developed to fight the fleet was never needed for its original purpose, but the military infrastructure it represented was preserved and upgraded with architect assistance, creating defensive systems that could theoretically protect Earth from conventional attacks by species at similar technological levels. Whether these defenses would matter against truly advanced civilizations was debatable, but maintaining them provided psychological comfort and signaled to potential threats that Earth wasn't helpless, even if it wasn't matching ancient powers. Speranza's military tradition evolved to focus more on peacekeeping and crisis response than pure combat, with soldiers training to support humanitarian operations and disaster relief across Earth, and eventually on other worlds where human aid workers assisted with reconstruction or development projects. The wall guard that had once defended against Ark attacks became more like an elite ranger service, maintaining readiness for emergencies, while spending most of their time on constructive missions that built goodwill and demonstrated human values. Former combat veterans found new purpose in these roles, applying skills learned during desperate fighting to help communities recover from natural disasters or navigate difficult transitions, and the sense that their capabilities could be used to protect and build rather than just destroy helped many process their wartime trauma. The Salvage Corps transformed completely, shifting from dangerous raids into Ark territory to archaeological and recovery operations that helped piece together Earth's history from pre-crisis times and understand what had been lost. Their work uncovered countless stories of communities that hadn't survived, preserving records and artifacts that would otherwise be forgotten as physical evidence degraded. These recovery operations sometimes found survivors who'd been isolated for decades in bunkers or remote locations, people who'd missed the entire arc of humanity's resistance and victory and emerged into a world completely transformed from what they'd known. Integrating these displaced individuals required patience and specialized support, helping them process not just the trauma they'd endured, but the shock of discovering that the world they'd been hiding from no longer existed. By 2095, 30 years after Operation Genesis and 15 years after first contact with the architects, Speranza had transformed so completely that visitors who'd known it during the siege years sometimes couldn't recognize it. And the city had become something its founders couldn't have imagined, a thriving cosmopolitan center that connected Earth to the galaxy, while maintaining its identity as the place where humanity had made its stand. Chen was elderly by this point and had stepped back from active leadership, but she remained a respected voice whose perspective bridged the crisis years and the reconstruction period. Remembering when opening those blast doors had been an act of desperate compassion, with no guarantee of anything beyond temporary shelter. The fortress city that had grown from that decision had saved humanity not just by surviving Ark's invasion, but by demonstrating that resistance was possible, that intelligent beings could adapt and overcome even when facing technologically superior threats designed to erase them. That legacy shaped how Earth approached its place in the galaxy, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence born from knowing they'd been tested and endured, that humanity could be broken by catastrophe and choose to rebuild rather than surrender. The question people asked now wasn't whether Ark had invaded Speranza, but what that invasion had taught them. And the answers were complex, because the lessons weren't simple. They'd learned that walls and weapons mattered, but so did adaptation and innovation, that survival sometimes required impossible choices and desperate gambles. That technology could be turned against its creators if you were clever and determined enough, that making alliances and seeking help wasn't weakness when facing threats beyond your capacity to handle alone. And perhaps most importantly, that the end of one crisis was just preparation for whatever challenges came next. Speranza stood as testament to all these lessons, a city that had been invaded and devastated, and had survived to become something greater than what it had been before catastrophe struck. And that transformation was ultimately the answer to whether Ark's invasion had succeeded, because yes, Ark had invaded, and yes, Speranza had fallen partially, and yes, thousands had died and the city had been forced to destroy its own infrastructure to survive. But none of that mattered as much as what came after, the rebuilding, an adaptation, and eventual transcendence that turned defeat into foundation for victory. The fortress city that Chen had tried to protect became the gateway through which humanity stepped onto a galactic stage, carrying with them the scars and wisdom earned through fighting an enemy that had nearly erased them. And those scars became credentials proving they deserved their place among civilizations far older and more established, because they'd faced extinction and refused to accept it, had turned their enemies' tools against them, and forced their way to survival through determination and innovation and the stubborn human refusal to die quietly. The galactic community's assessment of humanity shifted noticeably after Earth's first major contribution to collective security came in 2098, when a species called the Devourers launched raids into the contested region where Earth was located, attacking several worlds and overwhelming their defenses with swarm tactics that seemed unstoppable. The architects requested human assistance in analyzing the Devourer strategy because their initial responses had been ineffective, and Speranza's military analysts immediately recognized parallels to Ark's assault patterns. During Red Winter, the overwhelming numbers, the coordinated movements, the apparent willingness to sacrifice individual units to achieve strategic objectives. Chen came out of retirement to consult on defensive strategies, and what she proposed shocked the architect commanders, because it involved deliberately allowing Devourers to penetrate defensive perimeters before triggering coordinated counterattacks that would isolate and destroy attacking forces in segments, rather than trying to hold every position. The architects initially resisted this approach because it meant accepting temporary losses and giving ground, concepts that their military doctrine considered fundamentally wrong. But after conventional defenses failed, on 2 more worlds they authorized testing human strategies on a planet called Threshold that was next in the Devourer's apparent targeting sequence. Speranza sent military advisors and a battalion of soldiers who'd fought during the Ark crisis, veterans who understood fighting against seemingly impossible odds and adapting tactics in real time as situations evolved. The defense of Threshold became a proving ground for human military theory applied at interstellar scale, with Chen's strategies modified to account for alien psychology and technology, but maintaining core principles learned from fighting Ark. When the Devourers attacked, they initially broke through defensive lines, exactly as predicted, but the coordinated counterattack that followed caught them completely unprepared. Human forces using modified Shepherd units, alongside Architect heavy weapons, to create kill zones that shattered the swarm's cohesion and forced a retreat. The victory at Threshold elevated humanity's status dramatically because they'd solved a tactical problem that had stumped civilizations with millions of years more experience. And suddenly, Earth wasn't just a rescued world under architect protection, but a legitimate military power whose strategic thinking offered valuable perspectives. Speranza's role expanded rapidly as other species requested human military advisors and training programs, wanting to learn the adaptive warfare principles that had defeated both Ark and the Devourers. Webb worked with architect scientists to analyze why human military thinking was proving effective against threats that conventional approaches struggled with, and his research suggested it related to how humans processed uncertainty and chaos. That species, which had evolved in more stable environments, developed military doctrines optimized for predictable conflicts. While humanity's history of constant intraspecies warfare in unpredictable conditions had created cognitive frameworks better suited for adapting to novel threats. This theory was controversial because it implied that humanity's violent history was actually an advantage in certain contexts, a conclusion that made many uncomfortable, but that tactical results seemed to support. The military successes brought new challenges because other species started viewing Earth with a mixture of respect and concern, appreciating human contributions to collective defense while worrying about what a species this effective at warfare might do if their interests conflicted with galactic stability. Okonkwo spent enormous effort managing these perceptions, emphasizing humanity's preference for peace, while not backing down from the reality that Earth could defend itself and its allies effectively. The balance was delicate because appearing too peaceful would undermine the military credibility that had earned humanity a seat at strategic planning tables, while appearing too aggressive would confirm fears about young warlike species disrupting established order. Speranza became the primary interface for these diplomatic and military functions, hosting joint training facilities where human and alien soldiers learned to coordinate operations, research centers where tactical doctrines were developed and tested, and diplomatic quarters where representatives from dozens of species negotiated security arrangements and mutual defense pacts. The city's transformation from isolated fortress to interstellar hub happened so rapidly that long-time residents sometimes felt disoriented, walking streets where humans were now a slight majority, rather than the entire population, hearing languages that translation technology rendered comprehensible, but that still sounded alien and strange. The cultural exchange went both directions as humans learned about species whose histories and values were radically different from anything Earth had produced, challenging assumptions about what was universal versus culturally specific in how intelligent beings organized themselves and understood reality. Some of these encounters were uncomfortable because alien ethics didn't always align with human morals. Species that practiced forms of population control or resource allocation that humans found disturbing, or that didn't recognize individual rights in ways that seemed fundamental to human dignity. The Restoration Council struggled with how to engage with civilizations whose values conflicted with Earth's, while maintaining cooperative relationships necessary for security and prosperity. And the compromises required sometimes felt like betrayals of principles that the Ark Crisis had been fought to preserve. Chen argued that humanity needed to accept that galactic civilization contained genuine moral diversity, that not every species would share human values, and trying to impose those values would make Earth into an imperialist power, no different from the architects who'd nearly destroyed them through careless expansion. This perspective was unpopular with those who believed certain rights were universal and should be defended regardless of cultural differences. But it reflected pragmatic recognition that Earth didn't have the power to enforce its morality on civilizations that didn't accept it. The debates about these issues became central to how Speranza and Earth understood their role in the galaxy, whether to be cautious participants who adapted to existing norms or active advocates trying to shape galactic civilization toward values they believed were right. The younger generation that had grown up during Reconstruction generally favored the latter approach, believing humanity's unique perspective from having survived near extinction gave them moral authority to challenge injustices even in ancient civilizations, while older survivors of the Ark Crisis tended toward caution, remembering how close they'd come to annihilation and unwilling to risk that again for abstract principles. This generational divide played out in Speranza's politics as the city elected its first post-Chen leadership in 2099, with candidates representing different visions of Earth's galactic future, competing in campaigns that covered everything from military spending to cultural preservation to environmental policy. The election was momentous because it represented transition from crisis leadership to normal democratic governance, from figures who'd earned authority through survival to politicians who had to win it through persuasion and popular support. Chen herself refused to endorse any candidate despite pressure from multiple campaigns, arguing that her era was over and the next generation needed to chart their own course without being bound by the decisions and assumptions of those who'd fought Ark. The winning candidate was Maya Reeves, a former wall guard officer who'd fought at Threshold and represented a middle path between isolationism and aggressive engagement, promising to maintain Earth's military capabilities while pursuing diplomatic solutions wherever possible. Her administration faced immediate challenges as tensions in the contested region escalated, with multiple species making territorial claims and the architects appearing increasingly reluctant to enforce the security guarantees they'd made. When rectifying the seed crisis, intelligence suggested the architects were dealing with internal political divisions about their role in the region, with factions arguing they should withdraw and let local powers sort out their own conflicts, rather than maintaining expensive military presence, protecting younger civilizations. If the architects pulled back, it would leave Earth vulnerable to species that might see humanity as either threat or opportunity, and Speranza's strategic planning had to account for scenarios where they'd be defending themselves without the overwhelming support they'd relied on since first contact. Reeves authorized expansion of Earth's defensive infrastructure and acceleration of programs to develop indigenous technology that didn't depend on architect assistance, essentially preparing for the possibility that humanity would need to stand alone again, despite all the progress toward galactic integration. The military buildup was controversial because it consumed resources that could have gone to social programs or scientific research, but the alternative was accepting dependence on protectors whose commitment was becoming questionable. Webb's research programs took on new urgency as they worked to understand fundamental principles behind architect technology, rather than just copying what was provided, trying to develop genuinely human approaches to problems like faster-than-light travel and energy generation that would let Earth operate independently if necessary. The breakthroughs came slowly, because the physics involved were extraordinarily complex and human scientific infrastructure was still catching up to species that had been studying these questions for millennia. But steady progress was made, and by 2102 Earth had deployed its first Indigenous FTL drive on a ship designed and built entirely by human engineers using principles they actually understood rather than black box technology they'd been given. The achievement was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating that humanity could eventually stand as technological equals to species that currently outclassed them, that the gap wasn't permanent, but just a matter of time and effort to close. Speranza's shipyards expanded dramatically to support this indigenous technology development, building vessels that incorporated human design philosophies and tactical doctrines rather than copying alien templates. And the results were sometimes surprising because human approaches to problems like ship configuration and weapons placement differed from conventional solutions in ways that offered unexpected advantages. The first purely human-designed warship, named Resilience in honor of what the Ark Crisis had taught, incorporated defensive systems based on Shepard technology and offensive capabilities derived from studying Devourer swarm tactics, creating a hybrid that could theoretically match ships from more established powers in certain combat scenarios. Testing and development took years, but by 2105 Earth had a small fleet of indigenous vessels capable of defending the home system and projecting limited power into nearby regions, not enough to challenge major civilizations, but sufficient to make attacking Earth costly enough to deter opportunistic aggression. The fleet's existence changed diplomatic dynamics because Earth could now negotiate from a position of genuine rather than borrowed strength, and species that had been condescending toward humanity, as architect clients started treating them as independent actors whose interests had to be considered. Speranza hosted the first Earth-organized interstellar conference in 2106, bringing together representatives from regional powers to discuss security arrangements and economic cooperation, and the fact that other species accepted humanity's convening authority was itself significant. The conference established several important agreements about territorial boundaries and mutual defense protocols, but it also revealed continuing tensions about Earth's rapid rise and what that meant for established power structures. Some species openly resented humanity's prominence, arguing they hadn't earned their position through centuries of contribution to galactic civilization, but had been elevated artificially by architect guilt about the seed crisis. These resentments occasionally manifested in trade disputes or diplomatic incidents that required careful management to prevent escalation, and Speranza's diplomatic corps learned to navigate complex political environments where past grievances and cultural misunderstandings could derail negotiations that seemed straightforward. Okonkwo retired from active diplomacy in 2018, having spent nearly 30 years managing Earth's relationships with dozens of alien species and feeling the work had become too demanding for someone approaching 70. Her successor, a former student named David Park, who'd grown up studying her career, brought fresh energy but lacked the personal credibility that came from having lived through the Ark crisis and personally negotiated with the architects during rectification. This generational transition was happening across Earth's leadership, as the survivors who'd defined humanity's response to existential threat aged out of active roles and were replaced by people whose experience was entirely post-crisis. The shift changed Earth's institutional culture in subtle ways because the new generation hadn't been shaped by the same fears and desperations. They'd grown up knowing humanity had survived and confident that similar challenges could be overcome. And this confidence sometimes manifested as overconfidence that worried older advisors who remembered how close things had been. Chen watched these changes from increasing distance as age and health issues limited her ability to engage actively with current events, and she sometimes wondered whether the lessons of the Ark crisis would survive as lived memory faded and became just history that younger people studied rather than experienced. The Speranza archive continued expanding its collections and educational programs to preserve those lessons, but Chen understood there was a fundamental difference between knowing intellectually that your civilization almost died and having felt that possibility as immediate personal terror. The question of how to maintain appropriate caution and preparedness without letting past trauma define the future preoccupied her final years, and she wrote extensively about balancing these tensions, arguing that humanity needed to remember the Ark crisis well enough to stay ready for unexpected threats, while not letting that memory prevent them from embracing opportunities that required risk and vulnerability. Her death in 2010, at age 93, marked the end of an era, and the planetary mourning that followed reflected how completely she'd become identified with humanity's survival and emergence onto the galactic stage. Speranza's memorial service drew representatives from over 60 species and became an opportunity for reflection on how far Earth had come since those desperate days when opening blast doors to refugees had seemed like the most consequential decision Chen would ever make. The eulogies emphasized her leadership during impossible circumstances, but also her wisdom in stepping back when new circumstances required different approaches, her willingness to let go of power rather than clinging to authority earned through crisis. The massive public attendance at memorial events suggested that even generations who'd never lived under Ark's threat understood Chen's significance, though whether they truly grasped what she'd navigated or just appreciated her as historical figure was unclear. The years following Chen's death saw Speranza continue evolving as Earth's primary interface with galactic civilization, though the city's dominance began facing challenges from other settlements that had developed their own specialized roles and relationships. The Old Haven's Rest settlement, that had been Speranza's first contact during the blackout, had become a major commercial hub, specializing in trade between human and alien merchants, while settlements in former Australia focused on xenobiology research, and others developed reputations for specific industries or cultural exports. This diversification was healthy for Earth as a whole, but it meant Speranza couldn't maintain the central coordinating role it had held when Chen's leadership unified human responses to galactic integration. The city's identity crisis was real, as residents debated what Speranza should be now that it wasn't humanity's last fortress, or only major city, whether to lean into its historical significance and become primarily a memorial and museum city, or to develop new specializations that would keep it economically and politically relevant. Reeves' administration pursued the latter path, investing heavily in military research and training facilities that built on Speranza's legacy as Earth's primary defensive stronghold, positioning the city as the center for human strategic thinking and military innovation. The approach worked economically, but created cultural tensions because many residents felt the emphasis on military identity was inappropriate for a city trying to move beyond its crisis origins. That Speranza should represent humanity's hopes for peaceful galactic citizenship rather than its capacity for warfare. These debates reflected larger questions about Earth's role that remained unresolved decades after first contact. Whether humanity's distinguishing contribution to galactic civilization would be military capability and strategic thinking, or something else entirely. The cultural and artistic movements that emerged from Speranza during this period explored these tensions through works that processed the Ark Crisis trauma, while imagining different possible futures. The most celebrated piece was a massive installation in the old citadel called The Walls We Built, that incorporated actual fragments from the original defensive fortifications, alongside projections showing what Speranza had looked like at different periods and testimonies from people who'd lived through each era. Walking through the installation created an immersive experience of the city's transformation that left many visitors emotionally overwhelmed, forcing confrontation with how much had been lost and gained through the decades of crisis and recovery. Critics debated whether the installation glorified suffering or appropriately honored it, whether focusing on trauma was healthy for a civilization trying to move forward, or necessary for maintaining perspective on why certain values and vigilance mattered. The discussions these artworks provoked became important parts of how Speranza and Earth processed their history and decided what lessons to carry forward versus what burdens to set down. The Shepherd program, that had been so controversial during its development, was largely phased out by 2115 as purely human technology surpassed what could be achieved by reprogramming Ark units, and the last operational Shepherds were ceremonially deactivated and placed in museums as artifacts of a specific historical moment. Crane hadn't lived to see this transition, having died in 2107. But his legacy in establishing that humans could turn enemy technology against its creators influenced how Earth approached xenotechnology generally, maintaining careful study of alien systems both to understand potential threats and to identify capabilities that might be adapted for human use. The deactivation ceremonies prompted retrospectives on the Shepherd program's role in humanity's survival, acknowledging both its tactical effectiveness and the moral compromises it had required. And these retrospectives generally concluded that the program had been necessary, given the circumstances, but that its necessity didn't make it comfortable or entirely right. This willingness to sit with moral ambiguity, rather than demanding clear heroes and villains, became characteristic of how mature Earth society processed the Ark Crisis, recognizing that survival had required choices that couldn't be neatly categorized as purely good or evil. The political landscape on Earth stabilized into patterns that seemed likely to persist long-term, with governance systems balancing regional autonomy against planetary coordination, maintaining enough military capability to defend independence, while investing heavily in diplomatic relationships that made conflict less likely. Speranza's role in this system was secure, if not as dominant as during the crisis years, serving as political capital and military headquarters, while accepting that other cities would lead in different domains. The city's population demographics shifted as it became less exclusively human, with alien residents choosing Speranza for its historical significance and the opportunities its institutions offered. And the resulting cultural mixing created new traditions that blended human and various alien practices in ways that felt distinctly Speranza rather than purely Earth or purely galactic. The younger generations growing up in this mixed environment had perspectives their grandparents couldn't have imagined, seeing human and alien as categories that mattered less than individual character and shared interests, navigating multiple cultural frameworks with fluidity that seemed natural to them, but that older residents found disorienting. By 2120, 40 years after first contact with the architects and 55 years since Operation Genesis, Earth had become fully integrated into regional galactic civilization while maintaining distinct identity and independence, member of various economic and security alliances, without being subordinate to any single power. Speranza stood as the physical embodiment of this achievement, a city that had been built to resist invasion and had survived multiple forms of catastrophe to become a cosmopolitan center where past and future coexisted. The fortress walls that had defined the city's original purpose were preserved as historical monuments, while new architecture grew around and beyond them, creating visual metaphor for how humanity had moved past defensive isolation without forgetting why those defenses had been necessary. Walking Speranza's streets, you could see the layers of history, from the old Cascadian military installation that Chen had opened to refugees, through the fortress construction during the Ark Crisis, the rebuilding after Red Winter, the expansion during architect rectification, and the most recent developments as the city embraced its role in galactic civilization. Each layer told stories about what humans had faced and how they'd responded, creating a physical record of resilience and adaptation that inspired visitors from across known space. The question of whether Ark had invaded Speranza had become almost quaint, because of course, Ark had invaded. That was established historical fact, documented in exhaustive detail, but the more interesting question was what that invasion had ultimately meant. In the immediate aftermath, it had meant destruction and death and desperate struggle. But across decades, it had become the crucible that forced humanity to evolve beyond what they'd been, to develop capabilities and perspectives they wouldn't have discovered without being pushed to the edge of extinction. The invasion had succeeded in destroying the Speranza that existed before it, the fortress that thought walls could keep the world out. But it had failed to destroy the city's essence, the human determination to survive and build something worth preserving. That essence had rebuilt Speranza stronger and stranger, transforming it from defensive stronghold to gateway between worlds, and in doing so had transformed what it meant to be human in a universe far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined before Ark forced them to look beyond their own survival toward longer timescales and bigger questions. The emergence of what historians would later call the Second Architect Crisis began quietly in 2122, when deep space monitoring stations detected unusual energy signatures from the direction of the Architect's core territories, patterns that didn't match any known peaceful activity, but that weren't clearly hostile either. Speranza's intelligence analysts spent months trying to interpret the data, consulting with Architect liaisons who seemed increasingly evasive about what was happening in their home regions, deflecting questions with bureaucratic language that suggested either they didn't know or weren't authorized to share what they did know. The breakthrough in understanding came when a junior analyst named Kira Okonkwo, Sarah's granddaughter, who'd followed her into xenopolitical research, noticed correlations between the energy signatures and historical data from the original seed deployment, suggesting the architects might be launching another wave of terraforming projects on a scale that dwarfed what had been done to Earth. The implications were staggering because it meant the architects were expanding aggressively despite their stated commitment to respecting sapient civilizations. Either they'd abandoned that commitment or they'd found targets they didn't consider worth protecting, and either possibility threatened the regional stability that Earth's security depended on. Reeves brought the analysis to the Restoration Council, which had evolved into Earth's primary governing body, and the debate about how to respond revealed deep divisions about humanity's obligations and capabilities in galactic affairs. Some argued Earth should stay neutral in architect internal politics, that getting involved in conflicts between ancient civilizations would just make humanity a target, while others insisted that standing aside while the architects potentially committed the same crime against other species that they'd nearly committed against Earth would be moral failure that betrayed everything the Ark crisis had taught them. The Council eventually authorized Kira to lead a diplomatic mission to architect space to gather more information and communicate Earth's concerns about the detected activity, giving her authority to negotiate if opportunities arose, but emphasizing she couldn't commit Earth to any military involvement without explicit approval. The mission departed from Speranza in early 2123 aboard Resilience, the flagship of Earth's indigenous fleet, with a crew that mixed human military personnel, diplomats, and scientists equipped to analyze whatever they found. The journey to Architect Core space took weeks, even with FTL drives, crossing regions of space that few humans had visited and passing through territories controlled by species that regarded Earth with everything from friendly curiosity to hostile suspicion. Kira's diplomatic skills were tested repeatedly at waypoints where local authorities demanded explanations for why a human military vessel was heading toward Architect space, and she had to carefully frame their mission as peaceful inquiry rather than anything that could be interpreted as aggression or interference. The Architect territories, when they finally reached them, were simultaneously impressive and disturbing. Systems filled with megastructures that harvested stellar energy on scales Earth's engineering couldn't match, but also showing signs of stress and conflict that didn't fit the image of stable ancient civilization that the architects had presented. Several stations they passed showed battle damage, and when Kira requested information about what conflicts had caused it, architect officials either refused to answer or gave contradictory explanations that suggested either deliberate deception or genuinely fragmented command structure where different factions were operating independently. The central architect world they were directed to was called Foundation in human translation, a planet that had been completely transformed over millions of years into an artificial construct where natural geography had been replaced with engineered landscapes optimized for architect habitation and industry. Landing there felt surreal because the scale of everything was adjusted for beings larger than humans, making the crew feel like children in a world built for giants. And the cultural atmosphere was oppressive in ways that reminded several veterans of the tension during Ark Crisis, when every moment felt potentially threatening. Kira's meeting with architect leadership happened in a chamber designed to be intimidating, with representatives from multiple architect factions arranged in geometric patterns that conveyed hierarchical relationships humans couldn't fully decode. And the questioning began immediately before any pleasantries or diplomatic niceties. The architects wanted to know why Earth was sending military vessels to their space, whether this represented escalating ambitions or response to specific perceived threats, and their tone suggested they viewed human investigation as presumptuous interference in matters beyond Earth's authority. Kira responded by presenting the energy signature analysis and asking directly whether the architects were launching new terraforming campaigns, and if so, whether they were following the protocols they'd claimed to have adopted after the Earth rectification. The reaction was chaos, with different architect factions apparently having different answers, some denying any new campaigns, others defending them as legitimate expansion into unclaimed space, and a few seeming genuinely shocked, as if they hadn't known about activities their own civilization was conducting. The fragmentation suggested the architects were experiencing internal political breakdown, that the unified ancient civilization they'd presented to younger species was actually fractured into competing factions with divergent agendas. And this instability had massive implications for regional security, because the architect's power had been the main deterrent, preventing widespread conflict. Kira tried to navigate the political complexity to identify which faction might be reasonable to work with, but the meeting deteriorated as accusations started flying between architect groups, some blaming others for unauthorized military actions and treaty violations that suggested ongoing internal conflict far more serious than anything they'd admitted to external species. The human delegation was essentially dismissed with non-answers and warnings not to interfere in architect affairs, a response that Kira reported back to Earth as confirming their worst fears about architect instability and the potential for that instability to threaten everyone who'd relied on them for security guarantees. The Restoration Council faced impossible choices, because if architect civilization was fragmenting, then the Protectorate relationship Earth had built its strategy around was potentially worthless. But trying to build alternative security arrangements would require military capabilities Earth didn't have, and diplomatic relationships that would take years to establish. Speranza's strategic planning shifted into crisis mode as analysts tried to model potential scenarios and develop response options, drawing on lessons from the Ark Crisis about adapting to rapidly changing threat environments and making decisions with incomplete information. The parallels to pre-Ark conditions were uncomfortable because Earth was once again facing potential existential threat from technologically superior forces, but this time they had advantages they'd lacked before. Established relationships with other species, indigenous technology that wasn't completely outmatched, and institutional knowledge about how to organize resistance against overwhelming odds. Reeves authorized massive expansion of military production and acceleration of technology development programs, essentially preparing for worst-case scenarios where Earth would need to defend itself and possibly its allies against architect aggression or the power vacuum that architect collapse would create. The mobilization was controversial because it meant diverting resources from civilian programs and potentially militarizing Earth society in ways that many found disturbing, but the alternative was being unprepared if threats materialized. And the memory of how unpreparedness had nearly doomed humanity during the Ark Crisis made those arguments compelling. Speranza's shipyards worked around the clock building new vessels and upgrading existing ones with the latest human-developed weapons systems. while recruitment campaigns sought to expand Earth's military forces without resorting to conscription that would undermine the voluntary civic participation that defined post-crisis human society. The younger generation's response to these recruitment efforts was mixed, with some enthusiastically enlisting out of desire to protect Earth's achievements, while others questioned whether military buildup was necessary or whether it would become self-fulfilling prophecy that increased conflict risk. The debates played out across Earth's communication networks, with passionate arguments on all sides. And Speranza became the focal point because the city's martial traditions and institutional memory made it the natural center for military expansion, even as some residents resisted that identity. The situation escalated dramatically in 2124 when the energy signatures Earth had been monitoring resolved into actual architect fleet movements, massive forces deploying from core territories toward the contested region where Earth was located. An analysis suggested they were heading towards systems inhabited by species that had established relationships with humanity. Kira's intelligence network among sympathetic architect factions confirmed that hardline elements had essentially launched a coup, seizing control of military assets and initiating expansion campaigns that more moderate factions had opposed but couldn't prevent. The approaching fleets represented an existential threat to multiple civilizations, including potentially Earth, if they weren't stopped or convinced to change course. And the Restoration Council had to decide whether to intervene militarily or try diplomatic solutions that might fail while threats grew closer. The choice was complicated by uncertainty about architect capabilities, because even fragmented their technology was formidable, and Earth's military had never faced opponents at that level in serious combat. Training exercises and simulations could only approximate what actual battle against architect forces would be like. Webb had died the previous year, but his protégés in Earth's research programs provided analysis suggesting that human tactical advantages over conventional opponents might not translate against architects whose technology could potentially counter the adaptive strategies that had worked against Ark and the Devourers. Despite these concerns, the Council voted to intervene after species threatened by the approaching architect fleets formally requested Earth's assistance. Invoking mutual defense agreements and appealing to humanity's stated commitment to preventing the kind of catastrophe that had nearly destroyed them, Speranza became the staging ground for the largest military operation in human history, assembling a fleet of over 200 warships supported by logistics vessels, and coordinating with allied species to create a combined force that might credibly challenge architect military power. The fleet that departed from Speranza in mid-2124 carried nearly 50,000 human personnel, plus contingents from a dozen allied species, representing unprecedented cooperation between civilizations that had historically been rivals, or at best, cautious neighbors. The operation was named Covenant in reference to humanity's commitment to preventing another Ark-like catastrophe, and the symbolism was deliberate, because Earth's leadership wanted to clearly signal that they were fighting for principles established through their own suffering, rather than pursuing selfish interests. The journey to intercept the architect fleets took them through space that had been peaceful for centuries, and the populated systems they passed showed fear and hope in equal measure. Fear that they'd be caught in conflict between major powers, and hope that someone was finally standing up to architect aggression that many species had resented but felt powerless to resist. Kira accompanied the fleet as senior diplomatic advisor, carrying authorization to negotiate if the architects proved willing, but also to coordinate with allies if fighting became necessary. And she spent the journey building relationships with representatives from other species and trying to forge the unified command structure that would be essential if combat occurred. The first contact with architect forces happened in a system called Meridian, where a local civilization had been warned to evacuate because their world had been designated for terraforming, and the architect fleet was positioning to begin operations when the Covenant force arrived and demanded they cease and withdraw. The standoff lasted 3 days, with increasingly tense communications, as the architects insisted they were exercising legitimate expansion rights, while Kira argued they were violating their own stated principles and threatening species that deserved protection. The architect commander finally agreed to a face-to-face meeting aboard a neutral station, and Kira went, despite security concerns, because the alternative was fighting a battle that would kill thousands and potentially trigger wider war that nobody wanted. The negotiation was brutal because the architect position was fundamentally that younger species didn't have standing to dictate policy to ancient civilizations, that Earth's recent emergence didn't entitle them to challenge decisions made by beings who'd navigated galactic politics for millions of years. Kira countered that age didn't grant moral authority to commit atrocities, that the architect's own rectification of the Earth situation proved they recognized some actions were wrong regardless of technological capability, and that proceeding with forced terraforming would destroy any remaining credibility they had with younger civilizations. The architect commander seemed genuinely conflicted, suggesting that even within the hardline faction, there were doubts about the path they'd chosen, but ultimately stated he had orders from architect leadership and couldn't deviate without being replaced by someone more committed to expansion. The meeting ended without agreement, and both sides returned to their fleets, knowing combat was likely, though neither appeared eager to initiate it. The Battle of Meridian, when it finally began, was unlike anything humans had participated in before, because the architect weapons operated on principles that conventional defenses couldn't fully counter. Matter disintegration beams that bypassed shields, gravitational manipulation that crushed ships like physical hands squeezing metal, and swarms of autonomous units that made Ark's forces look primitive in comparison. The Covenant fleet suffered devastating losses in the first engagement, with over 30 ships destroyed before human commanders adapted tactics and started finding vulnerabilities in Architect's systems. The breakthrough came when a human captain named Torres recognized that architected weapons had predictable charge cycles and targeting protocols, meaning ships that moved in specific irregular patterns could avoid the most dangerous attacks while closing to ranges where human weapons were effective. The tactic spread through the fleet as Torres broadcast his findings, and the tide of battle shifted as Covenant forces started inflicting significant damage on Architect vessels that had seemed invulnerable. The fight lasted 18 hours and ended with both sides withdrawing to assess damage and reconsider strategies, a tactical draw that was actually a strategic victory for the Covenant, because they'd proven Architect military supremacy wasn't absolute, that younger species working together could credibly challenge ancient powers. The aftermath of Meridian changed galactic politics, fundamentally because species that had been neutral or passive suddenly saw that resistance to Architect expansion was possible, and multiple civilizations reached out to Earth requesting to join defensive alliances or acquire human tactical training. Speranza once again became a coordination center, this time not for human survival, but for a coalition of younger species organizing to constrain Architect aggression and demand recognition as legitimate voices in galactic governance. Reeves understood that humanity had stumbled into a leadership role they weren't entirely prepared for, that Earth's relatively recent emergence meant they lacked deep institutional knowledge of galactic politics that other species had accumulated over millennia, but the coalition was looking to them because they demonstrated both capability and willingness to fight for principle rather than just self-interest. The responsibility was enormous, and the risks were existential because if the conflict escalated into full war between the coalition and Architect loyalist factions, the destruction would make the Ark crisis look localized, potentially destabilizing entire regions of space and threatening billions of lives. Kira worked frantically to maintain diplomatic channels with moderate Architect factions, while military planners prepared for escalation scenarios, trying to find some path that would constrain hardline expansion without requiring complete military victory that might not be achievable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when a group of Architect dissidents contacted Earth directly, offering intelligence about internal political dynamics and suggesting that hardline factions could be undermined politically if their military campaigns failed to achieve quick victories. These dissidents, calling themselves the Renewal Movement, claimed to represent significant portions of Architect society who were horrified by the return to expansionist policies and who wanted to reform their civilization's relationship with younger species. But they needed external pressure to overcome entrenched power structures that had controlled Architect politics for thousands of years. Kira met with Renewal representatives in secret locations, risking her life because hardline Architects would certainly execute anyone discovered collaborating with aliens against their own civilization. and what she learned fundamentally changed her understanding of what Earth was actually fighting. The architects weren't monolithic ancients with unified purpose, but a deeply fractured society, struggling with internal contradictions between their stated values and historical practices, between factions that genuinely regretted the harm they'd caused and those who saw younger species as resources to be managed rather than equals to be respected. The renewal movement wanted to use the coalition's military pressure as leverage to force political reforms that would permanently constrain architect expansionism and establish enforceable principles protecting younger civilizations, essentially turning the external crisis into an opportunity for internal revolution. The strategy was risky because it required the coalition to maintain military pressure without escalating to total war, threading a needle where they inflicted enough defeats to weaken hardliners politically while not destroying so much architect infrastructure that moderate factions would be forced to choose loyalty over reform. Kira brought the proposal to the Restoration Council and the broader coalition leadership, sparking intense debate about whether to trust architect dissidents who might be manipulating Earth into strategies that served hidden agendas rather than coalition interests. The decision ultimately came down to whether humanity had learned the right lessons from the Ark crisis, whether the experience of fighting automated terraforming systems had taught them that complex problems sometimes required solutions beyond pure military victory, that understanding your enemy's internal politics could be as important as understanding their weapons. The Council voted to pursue coordinated strategy with the renewal movement while maintaining military readiness for escalation if the political approach failed, and Speranza's role evolved again to become the coordination point between coalition military operations and covert support for architect internal dissidents. The campaigns over the following year were carefully calibrated exercises in limited warfare, with coalition forces engaging architect expansion fleets in ways designed to maximize political embarrassment while minimizing casualties on both sides, demonstrating that architect military dominance was contested while avoiding the kind of atrocities that would unite all architect factions against them. Human tactical doctrine proved particularly valuable for these limited engagements, because the adaptive approaches developed fighting Ark translated well to situations requiring precise control, rather than total destruction, and coalition commanders learned to operate with surgical precision that impressed even species with far more military experience. The Battle of Threshold's return in 2125 became the template for these controlled conflicts, when coalition forces defended the world that had first proven human tactical value against a major architect assault, not by destroying the attacking fleet, but by systematically disabling their vessels and forcing retreat without catastrophic losses. The architect commander who surrendered after his flagship was crippled became an unexpected ally when Kira negotiated his defection, offering asylum and support for speaking publicly about the internal architect political crisis, and his testimony about hardline factions' willingness to sacrifice architect lives for expansion goals resonated within architect society in ways that coalition military victories alone couldn't achieve. The coalition's successes and the growing prominence of the renewal movement triggered backlash from architect hardliners who launched increasingly desperate operations trying to achieve victories that would restore their political standing. And these desperate operations became more brutal as restraint gave way to fury at younger species who refused to accept their designated place in galactic hierarchy. The worst atrocity occurred at a world called Sanctuary, where an architect battle group ignored surrender offers and proceeded to systematically bombard population centers, killing millions before coalition forces could intervene and destroy the attackers. The massacre shocked even hardline architect supporters and gave the renewal movement the political opening they needed, with massive protests erupting across architect space, demanding leadership changes and policy reforms. Speranza received delegations from architect dissidents seeking advice on how to organize resistance movements and build alternative governance structures. Ironic reversal, where ancient civilization was learning from humans who'd only recently emerged from their own existential crisis about how to transform society under catastrophic pressure. The expertise Speranza could offer came directly from the Ark crisis experience, how to maintain cohesion when systems are breaking down, how to make impossible choices about resource allocation and strategic priorities, how to preserve cultural values while adapting to circumstances that make traditional approaches non-viable. The fact that humans could contribute meaningfully to helping architects navigate political transformation was itself revolutionary, undermining assumptions about age equating to wisdom and establishing that recent survival of existential threat created knowledge that even ancient civilizations lacked. The architect political crisis reached its climax in 2126, when the renewal movement called for a convocation, an ancient architect political process that hadn't been invoked in over 50,000 years, where all major factions would gather to fundamentally restructure their civilization's governing principles and relationships with other species. The hardliners initially refused to participate, but coalition military pressure and internal unrest left them increasingly isolated. And eventually, most factions agreed to attend, with the understanding that outcomes would be binding on all architect communities. Earth was invited to send observers to the convocation, recognition of humanity's role in precipitating the crisis, and acknowledgement that any new architect political settlement needed to account for younger species' legitimate interests. Reeve selected a delegation led by Kira, and including representatives from Speranza's historical archives who could speak to humanity's experience with architect actions, essentially bringing the memory of the Ark crisis directly into architect political deliberations. The convocation was held at Foundation and lasted for 3 months, with thousands of architect representatives debating fundamental questions about their civilization's purpose and relationship to the wider galaxy. And the human observers watched ancient beings grapple with moral and political questions that seemed both profoundly alien and strangely familiar. The debates revealed that many architects had been uncomfortable with expansionist policies for millennia, but had lacked mechanisms to challenge entrenched leadership, that the appearance of unity and ancient wisdom that younger species perceived was actually stagnation, where valid dissent had been suppressed rather than engaged. The human delegation's most impactful contribution came when Kira presented testimony about the Ark crisis, not as accusation, but as case study in how architect policies had nearly destroyed a civilization, and what that destruction had cost both humans and ultimately architects themselves through the moral compromise and political instability it created. Her presentation included recordings from the Speranza archive, voices of people who'd lived through Red Winter, describing what it felt like to watch their city burn and make impossible choices about who to save. And the raw emotional impact of these testimonies affected architect delegates in ways that abstract political arguments couldn't match. Several architect representatives broke established protocol to apologize directly to the human delegation, expressing shame about what their civilization had done and commitment to ensuring it never happened again. And these spontaneous apologies became powerful moments that shifted the convocation's emotional tone from defensive justification to genuine moral reckoning. The political settlement that emerged from the convocation restructured architect governance to include representation for younger species and established enforceable limitations on expansion policies, essentially creating constitutional constraints that prevented any single architect faction from unilaterally pursuing actions like the seed campaigns. More significantly, the settlement included provisions for restitution to species harmed by past architect policies, with Earth designated as the first recipient and given authority to help design restitution frameworks that would apply to other affected civilizations. The restitution offered to Earth went far beyond the original rectification, including technology transfers, resource commitments, and formal recognition of human sovereignty and equality in galactic governance structures, essentially elevating Earth from protected client to full participant in shaping regional politics. Speranza's leadership understood that accepting restitution meant accepting responsibility for helping other species navigate relationships with the architects. That Earth was being positioned as intermediary and advocate, based on their experience surviving architect harm and their demonstrated willingness to engage constructively rather than seeking revenge. The role was both opportunity and burden because it would consume enormous resources and attention, while potentially making Earth a target for resentment from species who felt humans were receiving preferential treatment or collaborating too closely with former oppressors. The Restoration Council debated extensively whether to accept the restitution package or negotiate for something different, with arguments that accepting made Earth complicit in architect political rehabilitation, while rejecting risked insulting the renewal movement and undermining the coalition that had achieved the political transformation. The final decision was to accept, but with explicit conditions that restitution would be used primarily to help other affected species, rather than just enriching Earth, essentially committing to use architect resources to build the coalition's collective capabilities rather than pursuing narrowly human interests. This decision reflected values forged during the Ark crisis about the importance of cooperation and mutual support, applying lessons learned from humanity's own near extinction to how they engaged with galactic politics. The implementation of the Restitution Agreement transformed Speranza yet again, this time into a center for interspecies cooperation and development, where architect technology and resources flowed to coalition species under human administration and oversight. The city's institutions expanded to accommodate representatives from dozens of civilizations, creating a cosmopolitan environment that made the earlier post-rectification period look provincial by comparison, and the daily reality of Speranza became navigating incredible cultural and biological diversity while maintaining functional governance and social cohesion. The challenges were immense because different species had incompatible needs and values, environmental requirements that couldn't be met in the same spaces, communication barriers that translation technology only partially solved, and historical grievances between species that sometimes erupted into conflicts requiring mediation. Speranza's administration developed expertise in xenosocial management that became valuable export itself, with other multi-species settlements requesting human advisors to help them navigate similar challenges. The city that had been built to keep threats out had become a model for how diverse beings could coexist productively.